Good morning and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament of 2013. Could I please remind everyone present to turn off any mobile phones, tablets or other electronic devices. The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. Our second item of business today is to begin our oral evidence sessions as part of the committee's scrutiny of the draft budget 2014-2015. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting Kim Atkinson of the Scottish Sports Association, Amanda Coulthard of Western Bartonshire Council, Amanda Rowe of Aberdeenshire Council, Derek Shewan of the Robertson Construction Group representing the Scottish Building Federation, Shona Smith of Scottish Borders Council, and David Stewart of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. So welcome to you all this morning. Now we're in a round table format, so there are no opening statements, and if you wish to speak, you just indicate to me or to the clerk. Something like that will be fine. The session is intended to be a fluid discussion, so please feel free to contribute at any point. There's no Buggins' turn, so it's not as if I'm going to begin round everyone one by one. You may wish to contribute once or twice. You may want to contribute half a dozen times or more. Feel free to do so. I intend to structure the discussion around the questions in the committee's call for evidence. So we'll begin by asking views on the progress made by the Scottish Government in meeting its targets as set out in the National Performance Framework. But I'd like to just start with Kim and her report, which was very in-depth, actually a very interesting report. And she said that it's reassuring, and I quote, to note that the National Indicator for Increasing Physical Activity is identified as related to the income of We Live Longer, Healthier Lives. However, the benefits of people participating in sport and physical activity are not recognised as factors in delivering this outcome, nor is the inactivity of the nation recognised as a main challenge to this. And we recognise that the achievement of the outcome requires us to work across all areas of government. Clearly, the indication is, Kim, that the sport should be at the heart of everything. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through a wee bit of that, and then we can also discuss how the Scottish Government is meeting its targets as set out in the performance framework from your perspective and those of others around the room.
Thanks, Kenneth, and appreciate very much being here, so thank you very much to the committee for that. I think where we were coming from a sort of sport and physical activity angle, we're the representative body for the governing bodies for all the different sports in Scotland, representing the 52 governing bodies who represent 13,000 sports clubs and a fifth of this population who are members of a sports club, so it's a pretty significant number of people from that point of view. I guess where we were coming from to try and summarise that was, if we think about the key national outcome for sort of healthier as one of the strategic objectives, as being people living longer, healthier lives, which absolutely sounds like a super aim and something I'm sure we're all very supportive of. If you speak to Sir Harry Burns, the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, he'll tell you that the key indicator of how long people will live in this country is how physically active they are, more than any other indicator. Therefore, I suppose the proposal is that there's an aspect of mismatch. If the key indicator for healthier is people living longer, healthier lives, and our Chief Medical Officer is telling you that's how physically active people are, then I suppose the recommendation is that the aspect of physical activity as an indicator is actually given a little bit more prominence in relation to that indicator, but also across the other 14 other indicators where we believe there is a very strong correlation. And I think it's about thinking about physical activity in its broadest sense. So there is a dose response between physical activity, how physically active somebody is, and the health indicators and benefits that we get from that. So I think, if you talk to Sir Harry Burns, it does go on a sort of spectrum between physical activity and sport. But as I say, the more physically active you are, i.e. the more of us participating in sport and getting our heart rates going, actually the greater health benefits will come from that. So I think it is looking at that aspect of that indicator, what that means actually in people being even more active, and the settings whereby people can participate in sport. So as I mentioned already, there are 13,000 sports clubs in Scotland. People who participate in sport through a club participate for longer and more frequently than people who do in other settings. And I think if you add to that the mental health benefits that come through meeting different people, intergenerational connections, a different sense of community, and also the key aspects of volunteering. And again, there's evidence that shows people who volunteer live healthier lives, live happier lives, that aspect as well. So I guess we just feel, as a sort of summary to that part, Kenneth, that there's more that sport can do and there's more that physical activity can do within that indicator. And I think that's where that cross-budget approach works. And obviously within our evidence, we've also demonstrated impacts on education, impacts on justice, impacts on community and a number of other aspects which we feel would be strong under the prevention agenda, which I think is a clear aspect where it could be built on.
I mean, we've obviously got a fixed budget here, and one of the things actually which the committee have been wearied by every year is endless bids for additional money for a specific sector without any corresponding indication as to where that should come from. But you've actually indicated that savings could be made from the health budget in terms of sport. Is that how you would view it?
I think the health budget's always a difficult one, and I appreciate there are health budgets and there are health improvement budgets. Certainly in the submission that we made, when you start to look at the cost of of obesity, it's £175 million per year. When you start to add on the costs of hip fractures, diabetes, premature mortality, mental health, yes, there's a financial cost, but I think the very human cost is something we can't forget. 2,447 people die every year in Scotland simply due to being physically inactive. I'll say that again, 2,447,000 people. Now, for a developed world nation, that is a figure that staggers me every day. As is dictated in Scotland's physical activity strategy, it also states that if we were all 1% more physically active, we would save 157 lives a year and £85 million to the economy. Now, I'm sure that's not going to cost £85 million with a prevention theme, but I don't know how you put a quantity of finance on 157 lives a year. So I think there are some clear opportunities within that. I think what we can't forget when we think about the prevention theme within sport is that 90% of investment in sport in Scotland is through local authorities. It's a massive, massive spend. What does that mean when we then start to think about single outcome agreements, when we start to think about community planning, when physical activity is not even one of, as we mentioned, those focus targets within the health indicators? It's in there, but it's not one of the focus ones. Yet 90% of where we could be investing goes through local authorities. So how can we be a bit smarter with some of that prevention? The other thing, I suppose, convener, is there was a cross-party group on sport, which John Mason was kindly at just last week. And there was some really interesting discussion, as I'm sure John will remember, and there was a sort of synergy and proposal around looking at the lobby that the active travel sort of contingent have made, and saying their aspiration would be that 10% of the active travel, the transport budget is spent on active travel. And there was an interesting kind of question, I suppose, posed, John, is perhaps the fairest phrase, in saying, well, actually, what would a similar ambition look like for the health of this country if we were to look at the health budget and a proportion of that being invested in sport and physical activity? So there was no statement, no direct answer to that, but it was a very clear question that came out, I think, convener, around the different kinds of opportunities. And I think that's where we could look at that radical shift in prevention, which I know is what Campbell Christie called for, and where I feel we really could add strength. If you look at the government's overall purpose, if you look at health, I think there's a key aspect where prevention can feature much more strongly. That prevention agenda could really be bulked up, and I suppose our argument would be that sport and physical activity could make a key part to that. So that was a reflection on some of the discussion, as I say, that I know John was a key part of as well.
Okay, and coincidentally, John is asked to speak next, to be followed by David Stewart.
Yeah, it wasn't totally on that, but following on from that, I mean, I think the whole question of the indicators which has been raised in relation to sport, but I was also interested in, Mr Shewan, your paper, raising the issue of some of the indicators, for example, you know, the number of businesses that we have in Scotland. And I think probably when that indicator was set, we'd all have said, that's a good indicator because we want more businesses. But you're kind of saying, if I understand it correctly, well, there's bigger businesses and smaller businesses, there's different kinds of businesses. And a similar thing, I think, with modern apprenticeships. You're saying you feel that I think there's quite a range of quality in modern apprenticeships. And yet, you know, we could be changing the indicators every year, and that wouldn't work either because we get no consistency. So I suppose my general question for yourself and anybody else is, you know, how do we get this right between keeping consistency but being adaptable? You don't need to tell.
Sorry. I think there's two elements to that, you're quite right to say. In terms of businesses, and you know, Scottish construction industry consists of a wide range of businesses, from one-man businesses to multi-million pound businesses. And one of the things that we see in the construction industry in particular, the amount of businesses we have lost to our industry over the last 4 or 5 years. We've lost something like 655 businesses that went into liquidation in that period, which will never be recovered. And that's going to give us considerable concern going forward. As our industry hopefully improves, then you know, we're struggling to address how we cope with that and how we actually measure the benefits that we're getting back into our industry. We get a confused message because we try to, certainly as government sees it, and as I perceive, is that house building and construction get covered under the one umbrella. And they're actually two different elements of construction altogether. House builders are specific to house building. Very seldom do you get construction companies actually building houses. So you've got two different facets of it's got the same elements to it. It's got builder work, joiner work, whatever. But there are two different facets to it. And what we feel is that we get lack of recognition in the construction industry. All we hear about is house building and how house building is helping construction industry. Yeah, it's helping to a certain extent, but there's no recognition of construction. And we believe there should be some sort of indicator in there that actually reflects the benefits that the budget brings to construction industry rather than just house building. Going on to your second point with regards to apprenticeships, traditional apprenticeships, joiners, bricklayers and such like, are very much on the decline. As far as the Apprentice Training Council is concerned, we've lost something like 43% of our apprenticeships over the last 4 years. So we've lost probably 1,000 apprentices out of our industry. And we're finding that extremely difficult to try and replace. One, because our industry is in such a dire state that companies can't afford to support young people coming through, because it's a 4-year apprenticeship. It takes time, it takes money, and it takes effort. Effort which even we're finding that our mentors, the guys who are actually full tradesmen who will support these guys through their apprenticeship, they are now at a stage where they don't want to support them because it affects their earning capacity. So that gives us real concern. And again, whilst we really applaud what the government are doing in terms of getting young people back to work through modern apprenticeships, actually the quality apprenticeships, the traditional trade apprenticeships are still struggling. They're really struggling to get people back into our industry and get a grounding. Going forward, I believe that will become more and more of an issue, as I say, as we get back into perceived norm in our industry. We will not have the skills within it to deliver what we need to be delivering. And we'll have a major issue about to hit us within the next 5 to 10 years due to the lack of young people coming through with the skills that we require.
I mean, I just wondered, do you think then, do the indicators need tweaking or do they need a major revamp?
I think they don't need a major revamp, no, not at all. I do think they need some tweaking to reflect, I think, a major change in where we are as a country and certainly from our perspective as an industry. We need to be, have better appreciation and acknowledgement of where business is now compared to when the indicators were originally set. I think they need to reflect a changing market.
David, you don't agree that there should, with the Scottish Building Federation, that there is, and I quote, merit in developing additional national indicators to measure Scotland's performance in fostering the positive environment needed for the construction industry as a whole. You've said in your submission that there is a strong argument for fewer indicators and targets expressed in a clear manner.
What we were trying to get across in our submission was that on the one hand, we find in trying to look at what investment in housing achieves, from looking at the 16 national outcomes, I think there's an argument that investment in social housing has a benefit on each of these outcomes. But on the other hand, we feel that perhaps because understandably they're quite general, because they're looking to measure the benefits of investment in all sectors, in all areas that the Scottish Government funds, they're maybe not that helpful in allowing to measure the real impacts of investment in social housing. And so what we look to highlight in our submission is that while there's 2 national indicators that relate to housing, and they are really about providing access to affordable housing and advice for the most vulnerable, so I suppose essentially preventing or helping people who are homeless, and secondly, an indicator that measures actual numbers of units completed. While we feel that they are very important indicators and need to be measured, we feel that investment in affordable quality housing achieves so much more than that. To give a couple of examples, investment in energy efficiency and improving the energy efficiency of housing would create benefits for members of the Scottish Builders Federation. It would improve educational attainment by providing a warm, secure home for young people, and it would have benefits in terms of the health of the nation. Similarly, investing in medical adaptations in social housing and investing in housing support, again, it has impacts of the talk of preventative spend promoted by the Christie Commission that Kim was referring to. So it's not that we feel the indicators are wrong, and we do strongly believe that it's right to have a national framework to measure the impact of investment and then direct investment based on that. It's just that we feel with social housing there's perhaps scope for some refinement or further development of the indicators.
I mean, today you put a press release out saying that there should be at least an extra 21 million actually spent in energy efficiency, but you haven't indicated where in the budget that money should come from.
I absolutely take the point you make that the committee could get sick of hearing interest groups and bodies looking for further investment without saying where it comes from. On the other hand, I don't think it's really right for a housing federation to tell governments and politicians how to make spending decisions. All that we're really saying by putting out that press release is we believe investment in energy efficiency is extremely important. It's actually a very positive thing that the Scottish Government continues to invest in home energy efficiency because the UK Government doesn't, and we absolutely acknowledge that. However, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have set very tough climate change targets, and it has still a target to end fuel poverty, if practically possible, by 2016. What we're really saying is that in order to achieve those ambitions, we believe that investment in energy efficiency needs to be increased.
John wants to come in on this point.
Yes, one of my local housing associations said we should put 50 million more into housing and/or bedroom tax and take it out of the culture budget. Would you go along with that?
I wouldn't, as I said earlier, I feel we can make a case for the benefits of investing in housing, both social and health benefits and also economic. And I believe there was recently a report by Audit Scotland that identified challenges faced by the housing sector and also the fact that the demand for housing, social housing, continues to outstrip demand. As I said earlier, I think it's perhaps for us to make a case for the benefits of investing in housing and the need to invest, less so, I think, for us to tell politicians and government where to choose to take that investment from.
I mean, to be honest, I do actually think that's something of a cop-out. I mean, housing is going up 158.4 million, and if people aren't happy with the Scottish Government's choices, they should say what the different choices should be, not just give us more. I mean, one of the things that what impressed me so much about Kim's submission is that they did say you should reduce money in this area in order to spend it here. Last year, Age Scotland came to us and said we want more money for adaptations, and when we asked how that should be funded, they said change the age at which concessionary fares are actually awarded from 65 to 60. Pretty controversial when you're an age charity, one would have thought. Now, the Cabinet Secretary actually didn't change that, but he did actually increase the adaptations budget with 25%. So, I mean, I think, people have to, I think, come here with the courage of their convictions and say, this is where, in a fixed or declining budget, money should come from in order to fund what you wish to see funded, because otherwise, we just end up with a situation whereby, every organisation that comes to us believes their sector should have additional funding, and we're not really any further forward. Yes.
If I could come back on that, first of all, on the point about the budget increasing, we very much appreciate the fact that the budget has been increased. However, I think it's important to remember that follows on from a 29% cut in the budget for social housing, the capital budget that took place between 2008 and 9 and 2011 and 12. And I appreciate that we're in constrained financial times. However, you know, it's a good increase and it's great that money's come in, but to an extent it's more a restoration close to where we were 5 or so years ago. As far as suggesting where money comes from, this isn't about from the Scottish budget per se, but the SFHA and others have been campaigning for European structural funds to be ring-fenced and used to be an investment in energy efficiency and social housing. There's an excellent programme in Wales run by our sister federation that's used European structural funds to invest in energy efficiency and renewables, and has really done a lot to create jobs and apprentices, cut carbon emissions, and help to lift some of the poorest people out of fuel poverty. And I would, you know, we continue to recommend that as a source of funding.
Yeah, I think we all appreciate the reduction in housing funding, but there was a 26.9% cut in the Scottish Parliament's capital budget, so that was inevitable that reductions would happen somewhere or other. Gavin, to be followed by Jamie.
Am I allowed to return to sport?
Of course you can.
Good. Thank you.
You know
Just checking. I suppose I direct my remarks partly in Kim's direction, but I don't expect immediate. Well, I'll be very impressed if I get immediate answers. But I just think it's something to reflect upon. Clearly, it's not all about funding, but it's fundamental. You can't get away from it. What I find quite difficult as a member of this committee or as a spokesperson is working out what is the total funding from Scottish Government, and when I say Scottish Government, I mean central, local authorities and so on. What do we actually invest in sport as a country? It's very easy to look at the budget line for sport in the budget document and you think, right, great, that's what the line is for sport. But of course there's contribution from local authorities, contribution from the health budget, contribution, as you point out, from the justice budget via cashback for communities. What I found very difficult to get a handle on is just what is the baseline sport budget, in inverted commas. How does that compare to other countries, as it were, and what is the direction of travel? Because you look at one line and get an impression of where we are. But I find it very difficult to just because it's the way that I suppose the budget is packaged, to find out what is the sport budget. I don't know if that's work that you have done or something that that is being considered, but I just make that point.
I think it's a very fair point. I think, as you'll have seen, the sport budget in real terms for this year is 36.5 million. Yes, if you package it all together, it looks pretty big, but 161.2 on top of that is Commonwealth Games. So when you add all of that together, and if that's the line that you read for sport, it does look like a significant increase in investment over within the last 10 years. However, the recognition obviously is that a huge amount of that is towards the Commonwealth Games, and don't get me wrong, that is very much welcomed. But obviously the Commonwealth Games in its own right is bringing a host of other benefits, which obviously will relate to housing, a number of other colleagues and areas which again are really important. I think in broad terms the sports budget has remained fairly static. So that 36.5 million is the Scottish Government investment, which primarily is into Sport Scotland, as I understand it. So the 90% that's spent through local authorities is via a different budget line, and as you say, where that relates in terms of the money that goes from health and other partners, I presume is a different set of budget within there. But I think it does pose a fascinating question around yes, we've made some statements around working more closely within health. I suppose I want to be very clear, we're with no intention of trying to raid their budgets. I think it is about working in partnership. And I think some of the challenges that there are some very successful partnerships out there that have been demonstrated as pilots. So Jog Scotland being a good example. I'm sure hopefully most colleagues have heard of Jog Scotland. So Jog Scotland's been running for 10 years through our partners at Scottish Athletics. It is a programme obviously to try and get people running, but ultimately it starts with walking. So I think it is a good example of that continuum that I mentioned earlier between physical activity and sport. It's done in groups, it's run by voluntary leaders. So again, there's a lot of different aspects around some of that social capital that I know Sir Harry Burns would talk about. But despite the fact that it's been running for 10 years, it's still sort of on an annual funding basis where we're not really seeing that prevention shift and saying, well, we've got a pilot here that works. How do we make some of that change? So I think there are aspects of looking at who benefits, I suppose, is the proposal that we were making, Gavin, in saying, primarily most of the benefits that we get quoted back to us are health benefits, which again I could completely understand and would support. And let's not forget mental health is a significant benefit in that, and I know our partners at SAMH would agree with that. But I think when you look at some of the cashback models, I know that was one of the aspects that you mentioned. If you look at some of the examples from rugby, who again we quoted in our example with some of the work that they've been doing with the cashback for communities investment, it's incredibly strong around some of the work that they've done in schools, around behaviour, around attainment, around increased attendance. There are really strong results in saying, well, actually, this is just as money being invested and it's providing results in education. So I guess in looking through some of the different case studies that we've put forward, there are demonstrations in health, yes, but there are demonstrations in education, in justice, and the sports pot is funding quite a lot of that. Now, don't get me wrong, there are small examples of justice money from cashback and small examples of the health money. But ultimately, I suppose the argument is the key people that are going to benefit if more people take part in sport isn't sport. Yes, we'll benefit and we'll be delighted that there are more people hopefully having fun, because let's not lose the essence that hopefully people participating in sport is fun, convener. But ultimately, if the key beneficiaries are going to be health, if they're going to be justice and they're going to be education, then you've got a 36.5 million budget trying to fund much bigger budgets to provide support. So I suppose we were posing a fundamental question in that, but saying ultimately, I suppose it's the courage and the conviction that you mentioned yourself, convener, and saying that that's where we see it. Yes, you could get benefits tomorrow, and fingers crossed we will, in relation to mental health, and I know some of, as I say, our colleagues at SAMH are working on that. But the big term gains in health are longer term. So it's a bit of that courage and conviction that you mentioned, and looking beyond what is going to be one parliamentary and governmental cycle, and saying the longer terms are the benefit. But if we want people who live healthier and longer lives, then that's not going to happen tomorrow, and it is a culture change. So I think it's an aspect to some of that conviction. I think, as David was saying, it's not necessarily always about the money, it's about the prioritisation of aspects of that. And I suppose part of our reflection on the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework is around the prioritisation of budgets. So are we prioritising the national indicator for physical activity the way we would want to see it? No, we think there's an argument for that to be higher prioritised within that. And the impact that would have in relation to your budget question, Gavin, is around saying, well, if that's prioritised more highly by the Scottish Government in terms of the National Performance Framework, then that puts a different kind of opportunity, is what I would hope, for the local authorities for the 90% of the budget that they spend, in saying, well, actually, if that physical activity is a key indicator, then maybe there's something that we can do that adds more value. And obviously, they're the big potholders in the budget there. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they don't have pressures on their budgets either, but I think there are partnerships to be gained here, but by looking at a more sustainable approach in that longer term.
Jamie to follow by Michael.
Thank you, convener. I just want to dig into a couple of comments from to the local authorities that are with us today in terms of the National Performance Framework. The Scottish Borders Council said, where possible, it would be helpful if the data used to measure national performance was consistent with the data that we can use at a local authority level. And you give the example that there are differences in the way that you're asked to look at the life circumstances of children. I just wonder if there are other examples and what the practical effect of that is. And Western Berkshire Council suggests that given the focus nationally on prevention and early intervention, which is something obviously that we're very keen to see happening, but given the focus on that at all levels, it may be helpful and set a more positive tone if the national framework reflected this focus. So I just wondered if Shona and Amanda could maybe comment on their comments in a little more detail.
Sorry, Shona and Amanda Coulthard?
Yes,
Amanda?
indeed.
Yeah. Okay, Shona, and then Amanda, and then we'll go on to you, Michael.
Okay. First of all, sorry. Scottish Borders Council will be very supportive of the National Performance Framework and have used it extensively in this last year in developing our SOA, along with a local strategic assessment. However, we found that some of the Scotland Perform indicators and the SOA indicators were giving us different values. For example, in child deprivation, the Scotland Perform figure comes out about 8.2% for Borders, whereas the local one from the SOA menu comes out at 17%. And we look at then how that's measured, and there are differences in the way it's measured. Gives us an issue in that when we're developing the SOA, we're saying, right, you know, which figure is it we're going to use? We're going to use the local data. However, we then looked at the correlation, the trends. So I think what we'll be looking for is some consistency in that, so that we're talking about the same figures. And I think the other one we would maybe pick up on was child healthy weight, where there's a clinical measure and then there's a population percentile figure. And One's on a 3-year rolling average and one's on a 2-year rolling average. So again, when we talk with our health colleagues, because one of our main outcomes is reducing inequalities, we find again that we're talking different indicators, different figures, different targets. So I think we're very supportive of the framework, but I think we're just looking for some refinements and tweaks and alignment with the SOE development to the NPF.
How would you propose that is undertaken?
Well, I think what we're going to do at our local level is to sit down with health and decide which set of figures we're actually going to use. We've got a joint delivery team and a strategic board that all community planning partners sit on, and we're just going to decide at that point which set of figures we're going to use and relate to those for our purpose for community planning.
I suppose, I mean, and the first example you gave, the quite wide disparity between the two figures there, presumably you're wanting consistency in terms of assessment, in terms of figures. So how do you achieve that? I thought that was the fundamental point you were making.
Well, we're going to use the local figure. We're going to use the 17% figure because we feel...
What is it? How are you going to... there's a local figure and...
That's from Scottish National Statistics
okay.
through DWP.
Okay.
So there's another indicator, there's another way of measuring it at local level.
Yeah. But so the first figure you gave, that you said there was 8%.
Yeah.
Is that an 8% across the country? Was that 8% in your area?
That's for our area, yes.
So the point I'm trying to make is, you know, you're saying you will use one figure, but
yeah.
Wouldn't it be better if there was just one figure?
It would, but that's not what we're working on this year, okay. So we've taken the local figure.
Okay, but I thought the suggestion you were making is it would be better if there was one figure.
It
so
would.
How do we achieve that?
How do you achieve? Well, you've got to decide as the SOA, as a local outcome, the one that we would use at a local authority level.
Okay. So
I mean, sorry, Jamie, my concern is there, obviously, you've got 32 councils all going down the same road. I mean, the national performance indicators are going to be very difficult to have any kind of meaningful assessment if you've got 32 local authority measures and potentially health board measures as well. Surely it's all better if everybody works to the same all Scottish figures.
Mm-hmm. So I would question how we developed the SOA one.
It's in terms of Amanda, just in terms of the comments you made in terms of trying to get the early intervention more reflect in terms of the National Performance Framework. I wonder if you could tell us, you know, why that would be a good thing.
I think picking up on some of the other points that have been made already this morning, often there are so many different indicators that can be used or different priorities that can be focused on. It's quite difficult for everybody around the table to agree on what it is we're trying to achieve and how we all collaboratively work towards that. If we had a focus in the National Performance Framework on the key deliverable outcomes for the entire area across all of the partners who are involved in delivering it, and we all agree that prevention and early intervention has to be the focus if we're going to change the poor outcomes for the majority of the population, particularly in Western Bartonshire. We all need to understand what it is we're trying to achieve, and we need the space round about prevention and early intervention focus to say, what do we do just now, what do we have to do differently to take us towards the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And then there is a bit about how do we show that we're making a difference, how do we assign budget based on the things that we want to do differently. The way that we do it just now is very much about what each agency brings to the table and how that relates to their own priorities rather than what we all do collectively and how we develop a new focus. The submission that we made from Western Bartonshire looked at the Change Fund for older people and also the Change Fund for early years and the focus there on doing things differently. And I think what we're asking for out of the National Performance Framework is a focus on doing things differently across all of the priorities rather than specifically the outcomes for older people in early years. Picking up on Shona's point about the way that we use data, I think for me, one of the biggest challenges we have when we're pulling together performance information and profiles is that there are a number of different indicators we can use depending on what story we want to tell. If we wanted to create a very positive picture, we would use the national figure in terms of child deprivation because it looks like things are better than they are. If we wanted to have everyone focus on it and maybe think about how we spend money and to gain more investment, we would use the 17% figure because it focuses the mind on what we have to do. For me, the issue is more about how the different data sets are pulled together. The menu of local outcome indicators that's used for the single outcome agreement is pulled together by the community planning team in government. They don't use the indicators that are in the National Performance Framework. It would make much more sense if everything flowed from the framework and just became more localised as we took it down in terms of what we're delivering. By having the option of pulling from different sources, it makes it easy to either place too much attention on an indicator or to mask just how bad performance is.
That's very helpful, actually. Michael? Oh, and Michael, sorry, I just wanted to say that Kim talked about enjoyment of sport through participation. You would agree after last night that certainly participating in sport is probably more pleasurable than watching it.
No,
this particular time.
I enjoyed a very good football match last week. You know what I mean? You obviously weren't there, because if you had been there, you would have said it was a very exciting game of football, and that's what it's about, and that's why we love the sport.
Indeed, absolutely. Who cares what the result?
Fortunately, my question was going to be in the same area in terms of the local authorities, but I was going to use Aberdeenshire submission as my sort of reference point. And then the questions that were posed about the progress being made by the Scottish Government in meeting the national outcomes, and whether the national indicators are effective as a means of measuring the performance of government. Aberdeenshire pointed out that the key national indicators supporting economic growth, sustainability and health are demonstrating maintained rather than improving performance, while the indicators and targets currently in place do not adequately demonstrate the public sector reform agenda, and it's not evident that the priorities set out as part of the Ministerial Review of Community Planning are reflected in the NPF. So I just wanted to sort of test that a bit, because clearly when we are looking at the budget and whether the budget is going to meet the NPF, we need to know that what's being measured and the outcomes that are being pursued are going to be reflected in how the budget's going forward. So it would be useful to know, from your perspective, where the budget sits in relation to that.
Okay, thank you. I can't speak on financial matters because I'm a performance person, so in terms of budgetary discussions, that's not an area I can say a lot on. But in terms of the performance framework, if I start with the last question first, and we did reflect that the Ministerial Review of Community Planning Partnerships and the priorities that came out of that do not appear to be explicitly reflected within the National Performance Framework. That's not to say that the outcomes of that are stated by the Review of Community Planning Partnerships aren't within the National Performance Framework, but it's not clear if you go in via the National Performance Framework that the Single Outcome Agreement and Community Planning Partnerships are underpinning the delivery of those outcomes. It's clear if you come in through community planning, but it's not clear if you come in through any other direction. And for the residents and communities that are out there, I don't think they would appreciate that a lot of the work that's done within the community planning partnerships by the different partners is actually delivering what the Scottish Government has said are the outcomes, the national outcomes that we want for Scotland. So similar, I think, to the discussions that Amanda and Shona were saying, is we would be looking to have more consistency between the National Performance Framework and perhaps the indicators that we use in other places. So, for example, we have the statutory performance indicators that we use in Audit Scotland. We have the local indicators menu set that came out. I think of the improvement service. We would like to see them more tied together within the National Performance Framework, because that would then allow community planning partnerships and 32 local authorities to be able to evidence more clearly how they are supporting the delivery of the national outcomes while still meeting our own local priority outcomes. In relation to the national outcomes where we had suggested within Aberdeenshire Council that perhaps performance was maintaining or even declining, it was by looking at the indicators that were there and looking at the direction of travel of those indicators. And also making an assumption, because I couldn't evidence anywhere what weightings are put on the different indicators, and as far as I can tell, every indicator in the National Performance Framework appears to have an equal weighting. Now, that might be correct, and that might be a good thing, but it also means it's very difficult to show that certain very key priorities and very key outcomes that are being delivered are perhaps driving the outcomes further forward, and other indicators that perhaps are in areas that are still important, but if we maybe don't meet them to the same extent, wouldn't pull performance down and wouldn't suggest to communities that actually we're not delivering on some of the key outcomes that were set. So it was from that basis that if you just take each indicator and say it has an equal weighting, then it does look like performance is stalling, and sometimes you need to get into the narrative and more to actually discover that perhaps performance isn't the way it is suggested by the framework.
John, to be followed by Jean.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, just a couple of other points, especially looking at Western Bartonshire's submission and talking about, at times there's inconsistent messages. That's paragraph 7 from different divisions within government. And also in paragraph 12, you bring up the whole area of prevention, which we're very interested in. I mean, I'm just wondering, do you think there is broad agreement, or can there be broad agreement as to what is preventative spending? And can that actually be measured, or is it just impossible? Is everything preventative spending in the end?
I think my experience to date would suggest there can't be agreement on what preventative spending is. It's been very difficult to get even a common understanding of what prevention is around partnership tables. Everyone approaches it differently depending on the service that they're delivering and how close to sharp end service they are. I think with a bit of work nationally and locally, we can come up with a strong definition of what preventative activity is. I do think, though, that just about everything we do across all of the public sector agencies and wider voluntary organisations and private sector can be preventative. We have many opportunities to interact with individuals and change the direction of the services that they receive and the potential outcomes from their experiences. So it's about making sure that every opportunity we have, every point of contact that we have, we take the moment that we need to have a preventative message in there, whether it's when someone comes along for a GP appointment and there's a list of different areas of discussion that the GP can use with them, where we can start a conversation about what they do differently, the outcomes that they want to achieve for themselves, or whether it's very basic things like interaction with universal services, how people feel about the contacts they have with people who are emptying the bins through the day, and whether they have a relationship and understand the valuable service that's delivered through our environmental services and local government, how that relates to the environment that they live in, how they feel about the area that they live in. So there are lots of opportunities for us to have more of a focus on prevention than we have at the moment. I think the biggest challenge we have, particularly in local government, is how we free up resource to allow us to have those conversations. Everyone is feeling the pressure of reduced budgets nationally, I know, but if we want to really focus on prevention, then I think we need to rethink the way that we align our budgets to allow us to do that. And that's at a national and a local level, and it's a discussion we're all having just now. I don't think anyone's found the answer yet, though.
Yeah, because, I mean, even some of the way you answer that question, I mean, it's good, it's frank, but I mean, if a visit to a GP, which might be only 10 minutes, could then be split up between reactive and preventative, there's no way we can kind of control that or even know that. So, I mean, ultimately, is it more about changing attitudes rather than actually measuring it all?
Absolutely. I think it is a complete culture change in the way we interact with services, with individuals, with each other. It's very much about the focus on how we change people's lives, basically, and professionals across the spectrum thinking differently about the time that they have with individuals and how they use that time and what they want to focus on. I don't think we can capture all of it, but we can set a general direction that would be quite helpful for all services to work to.
I don't know if the other two councils agree with that. Or?
Yeah, I did something. One of the exercises this year of developing our SOE was to develop a prevention plan, and the guidance around it was quite loose, and I think Scottish Borders struggled to pull together that prevention plan. However, having submitted it with our SOE and the feedback we've had from the quality assurance team, I think it's given us a much sharper focus, and we're going to be having discussions between now and Christmas about what prevention actually means for our community planning partnership, because we, again, have had very different ideas about that when we came to bring the prevention plan together. But I would say, if anything, it's given us a much sharper focus on questions that we need to be discussing within ourselves. So it's been a very useful exercise in bringing that together.
Okay, thanks so much.
Amanda, Ro?
I think we would agree that it's a mind change. It's very difficult to measure it. It is going to be a culture change, and certainly the discussions within our community planning partnership and within our council is saying that prevention has just got to be at the heart of everything you do. It's not something separate, and you can't kind of say that bit's prevention and that's everything else we do. We have to move into saying everything we do, the starting point should be, can it be about prevention, and how does delivering this stop this happening in the future?
And how, if at all, would you change the national performance framework to reflect prevention?
Sorry,
How would you change the national performance framework to better reflect a preventative approach?
I certainly don't think you could do it by just simply having an indicator. I think it probably becomes more like some of the approaches we've taken around the improvement statements that councils are asked to do around efficiency and public service improvement, some of the work that we have to do around climate change declarations and the work equalities we have to do, our mainstreaming equalities reports. I think it's more a narrative perhaps that we have to build into through our community planning partnership, because I think that is absolutely where it sits, and I think the right starting point is the fact that we have to include it within the single outcome agreements now. So perhaps within the National Performance Framework we need some way to link in to the single outcome agreements more explicitly.
Shona, did you want to comment on that?
I think the next prevention plan will be a much sharper focus, let's say, for Scottish Borders, and I think we will start to be thinking about the indicators that should come out of that to reflect that prevention spend. So I think it's at a level of maturity at the moment. It's the first time we've actually included a prevention plan. So I think it's probably too early to say how it can link up, but certainly that we'd be looking at that over the next 5 years.
Okay, Amanda.
I think a focus on what we want to deliver collaboratively in the NPF in terms of the outcomes under the strategic priorities would be helpful for the focus on prevention. I think there's also a need to take a tiered approach to the indicators that we use. There are some very strong high-level indicators about direction of travel that in the NPF which we would all want to keep and want to focus on, but there's a level underneath that about what individual agencies bring to the table and how we work differently. That would be quite helpful to have there. It doesn't need to sit in the NPF, but we all need to know what those measures are, and we have to work consistently across the 32 community planning partnerships and the 32 local authorities to make sure we deliver that. I think because of the way we have the NPF structured at the moment, everything sits at one level and everything is equally weighted. If we either had a bit of more of a focus on the absolutely key measures and how important they are, or had another level of indicator underneath that allowed us to flex slightly without having to change direction completely, we would maybe be in a better position to focus on prevention and to show what we're all bringing to the table collectively to deliver a prevention agenda.
Kim, you wanted to come in before Jean gets to contribute.
Thank you. Yes, I think it was. There are a couple of things in terms of your overall question about the what can the National Performance Framework do around that. I think for me it's a tweaking perhaps of the overarching purpose and saying yes, sustainable economic growth, we can understand why that would be a priority, but I guess there are words that we proposed around healthier life choices, reducing inequalities, which are some of the discussions that we've had today, which I really think are a fundamental focus of what makes a successful nation. But I think they're also key aspects of fairness and equality, and also aspects that we've touched around prevention. So I suppose at a high level suggestion that there are words around there which might add further weight to that, with some of the colleagues have mentioned from local authorities that would add some further weighting to that. I think fundamentally there's also a balance between prevention and spend. And I guess I know that some of the preventative spend models are, if you spend a bit of money here, you'll save a bit of money there. Now, I can't argue with the idea that we all need to save money here and there, but I think there's also that overarching point that I made earlier around prevention of ill health and other things, where you just can't argue with saving lives. So yes, we can save a little bit of money if we do this rather than this, but ultimately we can save an awful lot of money if we do this and we do that, and we can actually save lives, and we can make people's lives better, we can make them healthier, and we can make them happier. So I think there are, call me an idealist, but there are, I think, wider arching principles under which the prevention agenda can be built upon, much as we need to make tweaks and savings here and there. If we really are looking at this genuine radical approach, a couple of pennies here and a couple of pennies there aren't going to cut it, and I think there is more that we can do. I think one of the suggestions that we proposed in our submission was around some of the change funds. Now, again, I don't know a huge amount about them. The feedback that we've had is that sport hasn't been hugely involved in that. But no colleagues touched on early years earlier, and again, we can't argue with that. But again, if you look at some of the indicators that we mentioned, that the contribution that sport can have, or some of those 14 indicators, which it is around, is information around education, healthy birth weight, our argument is if young people are physically active at a young age, then they have the opportunity to be physically active for life. And again, that's a tool, and it's a tool for providing any number of different prevention arguments. So we made a proposal that potentially there should be a change fund for sport, and that actually sport, through some of that different work, could look at something radical. When you look at the amount of money that's spent on hip fractures, so 1 in 2 women and 1 in 5 men will suffer a hip fracture before the age of 50. Financial burden of which is 1.7 billion across the UK every year. Now, you start to multiply and add that up, and don't get me wrong, it's a train of thought rather than there being any research, but people who have better balance are often people who participate in sport. are physically active. So therefore, possibly less likely to have a hip fracture. If you fracture your hip, you're more likely to spend time in hospital, potentially require impact on social care. So when we're looking at this big social care regeneration aspect, what does that look like, and how are we actually looking at some of the foundation, looking at prevention in the longer term? Now, I don't know what the research is around some of that. I'm sure there must be some, but if you bowl twice a week, maybe your fingers are just that bit more dexterous that you can do your buttons a little bit longer and brush your teeth yourself that little bit longer. So if the longer term impact is actually on social care, which yes, hopefully will have an impact on health. Now, I don't know what the research is around some of that, convener, but I think there would be a change fund aspect that could provide something really strong, which wouldn't just save lives, but would save the money that I know our key partners are working towards as well. I think the other aspect is around community planning, which has been touched on, and how we can be a little bit smarter around some of that, because I recognise that must be an enormous challenge. I think where we are is trying to think about slightly different partnerships. So as I mentioned, there are 13,000 voluntary sports clubs in Scotland. And I don't think there's a huge interaction between sport and community planning at this stage. And I think that's something we would very much welcome, and how we can be a little bit smarter about that. So how can we work more closely together? What's the contribution that our members as the governing bodies can support through their clubs? So participation in sport at a high level, we understand, is fairly static. Don't get me wrong, there have been changes in that. So Scottish Cycling have recognised a 160% increase in their membership since 2008. Nothing to do with the Olympics and the Paralympics. For the first part of that, yes, I'm sure that will come through, and the Commonwealth Games will come through. But legacy is what they do day in, day out in trying to get more people more active more often. And I think there's a key link that we can make with some of that. And it's about looking at community sports clubs as an asset. So these clubs are providing physical activity opportunities within communities which are impacting on these targets, which are part of local authority targets and which are part of the National Performance Framework. And I don't think we necessarily always see clubs in that way. So it's an opportunity for them to engage more with community planning, to actually have that voice as that huge community of interest, a fifth of our population, to try and engage in a slightly different way. And if we can look at partnerships in a different way like that, then I think there's an opportunity to look at prioritising budgets slightly differently, and whether that's with partners in local authorities, whether that's with partners within health, there are different kinds of opportunities come with that. So I see it all being a package coming together. So I'm an optimist as ever, convener, but I think there are some opportunities in there.
Jean.
Thank you. I'm really quite interested in the localism aspect of this, and how local authorities, particularly the representatives from there, use Scotland Performs, and whether that's, I know that's just everything that we're talking about, but even in the light of everything that Kim is saying, I mean, I immediately think the area that I represent is Highlands and Islands and sports facilities and so on. It's possible to have a bike, but quite difficult to get from A to B on a bike, because there's probably about 80 miles to your nearest centre or whatever. But how much are these kind of localism? I mean, if we look at for example, the Office of National Statistics produces fairly localised information about some of the aspects of things that we're talking about, and even on to the detail of hip replacements or whatever. How much of that becomes the centre for your activity and your work, rather than Scotland Performs? And Scotland Performs has its critics, and I wonder if you how you use that. It was based on Virginia Performs, which apparently is a much more kind of super and informative site. And I just wondered if you could have reflections on that.
Can I just respond, just tying up to Kim's point there on change funds, give you an example of how we're using some of that change fund money directly to the hip fractures. Change fund at the moment is financing reshaping care for older people in Scottish Borders, and one of the projects that we have in there is prevention of falls. And we met yesterday and have been meeting for about the last 6 or 7 months. Colleagues from Fire and Rescue, Health, Police Scotland, registered social landlords and our sports facility managers, to see how we can have residents of the Borders having a more active lifestyle. And that then ties back to Scotland Performs to say, what is the activity level of people in the Scottish Borders? There's a very simple example of how we're tying that change fund money up.
Okay, thank you. Amanda, I was actually going to come to you next anyway, but I'll let you have a wee word first before I go into what I was going to ask you, because I'm going to change tack slightly.
Okay, I think in relation to how we use the variety of different data sources that are available to us, we do tend to use things like the Scottish National Statistics, the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation publications to take our information to a neighbourhood level. We do produce a lot of information, a profile for the authority as a whole. But I think what we recognise more and more is that people don't want to talk about the picture for the local authority, they want to talk about the picture for their own neighbourhood. So we tend to use more comprehensive data sources that come down to a ward level or a data zone level for the index multiple deprivation to build a profile of a small community that we can start having conversations about. Does this look like the area you live in? Do you recognise it? And then let's start prioritising based on what that information is telling us if people feel that it's accurate. We link it all back up to the National Performance Framework, but we do use a number of data sources to have the conversations first and then bring it back to a higher level after that.
How much of the change fund is actually new money for the council?
Sadly, I'm not the manager for Change Fund, so I wouldn't be able to give a lot of detail on it. I think from the discussions that we've had, the investment on Change Fund activity isn't new money, it's the same money spent differently. And I think it's given us the opportunity. I know that we mentioned in our submission bridging finance, and we are seeing the Change Fund very much as that bridging between the way that we work now and the way that we have to work in future. And our plans are focused very much on how the fund can allow us to free up resources in the longer term to continue to fund the new activity that we've designed through both Change Funds. But it's not new money, it's just given us the opportunity to take a step back and think differently about how we spend the resource we already have.
Okay, Mandaro.
Just in response to Jean's query about how do local authorities use Scotland Performs, and I think most local authorities will have a version of Scotland Performs within their council. We have Aberdeenshire Performs, there is West Lothian Performs. We all had, I think most of us have taken Scotland Performs and sat it as one of the drivers within our own strategic planning frameworks. And through our community planning partnerships and our single outcome agreements, we identify our priorities through that, which will tie back up into the national outcomes. And then we put our localised element to it through things like our strategic assessments using the more localised data. But throughout, whether you look at our council plan or our business plans, which are on a service level, so infrastructure services or housing and social work, we always try and have that line of sight going back up to say, by doing this at a local level, and it's a local priority outcome for us, we can still demonstrate that on a national level we are contributing to the delivery of a national outcome for Scotland.
I want to, before I let you in, Jean, okay, I'll let you in slightly, then I want to change tack here.
But really just to make a point, and I in the light of Kim's enthusiasm for sport, which I don't share at all. Bell sport.
Yet, Jean, yet.
To the extent that Kim has it, I don't think.
Indeed. But again, I guess it's the local authorities, but recognising that there's lots of routes to the kind of outcomes that Kim's referring to that sports can deliver. I mean, that, you know, on another day we might have people here from creative arts or other community activities, social enterprises. And we know that people involved in their community, actively in their community, people who volunteer, not necessarily in the sports field, but in lots of other aspects of community life, actually have the same outputs, or the same result that we're talking about: leading healthier lives, living longer, and being more active, and not a drain on social services. So, again, the recording of that, or the recognition of that. And it's difficult to put a label on everything, I think, that's done. But again, I think that's a very local thing. I mean, there are regional differences, regional possibilities, just because of where we live.
I try to make that point when I'm trying to persuade people to deliver my leaflets. You know? The point I want to move on to is the linkage between the performance information and spending priorities and any evidence of the impact of the NPF on spending decisions. So that's why I'm going to come back to yourself, Amanda. And in paragraph 14 of your submission, you say, and I quote, "Within the national framework, it is difficult to evidence the link between the outcomes, objectives and the spending review resource allocation decisions." And I think that's obviously a key point for us, and I want to take some time to discuss that, and hope colleagues will come in on the back of that. But Amanda?
I think there's a recognition that we still budget the way that we've budgeted for a number of years in the public sector, and we don't necessarily start, we couldn't start with a blank sheet of paper and work out what it is we want to do and then how best to spend the resource available to us to deliver that. So we work around the edges, we make small incremental changes, and I think the point in our submission was more about how we step up the pace of those changes, how we make them more significant in terms of how we align our budgets. I think we're all keen to move to outcome-based budgeting, and that reflects a lot of the discussion we've had this morning about what it is we want to achieve and how we make sure we're able to deliver that. I certainly, from a Western Bartonshire perspective, would say we don't have outcome-based budgets at the moment. I don't think any local authority has. So we want to take the opportunity to have a discussion across Scotland about how we would do that, how we would best inform an outcome-based budget and what it is we would have to do to get us there. But we're really keen to move in that direction, and I suppose we're making a plea for support to do that as well. We'd be up for giving it a go, but we would need a lot of help to get us there.
Sure. What kind of help would you need?
I think there's some work to be done in understanding how we align budgets just now, how the things that are musts, particularly when you think about the services that are delivered in local government, what do we absolutely have to deliver, how do we deliver that in the most appropriate way, and what resource would be required to do that, and then what's left, and how do we assign that in a different way? Do we want to focus on a single priority? I think there's a recognition that if we increase employment opportunities, we then have a knock-on effect on a number of different outcomes round about health and well-being. So could we potentially focus some of the money on addressing employment opportunities and a wide spectrum of services around that, knowing that it will deliver the outcomes we want in a number of service areas, rather than focusing on each service area and how we align a budget to that individually?
Okay, David, to be followed by Amanda Rowe.
Thank you. I'd really just wanted to come back to the point I'd made earlier that as far as investment in housing goes, we have a concern that there's only 2 national indicators, and they really measure progress and success in helping homeless people access services and housing, and also the actual production of housing. Also, a recent Audit Scotland report into housing suggested that there was a need to improve the reliability on information on the impact of investment in housing, and really to produce better quality information. We suggested in our submission that it would be possible to build on the work of the Housing Policy Advisory Group. This is a group led by senior civil servants in housing and regeneration in the Scottish Government, and they work with the chief executives and directors of housing bodies such as ourselves, the Chartered Institute of Housing and Homes for Scotland. And they've suggested 4 key areas that need to be measured to look at what the impact of investment in housing is, and that's a well-functioning housing system, high-quality sustainable homes, homes that meet people's needs, and sustainable communities. We think that if work was done possibly by this group to further develop these areas, and that could feed into the National Performance Framework, then that would allow government, I think, to better measure the impact of investment in housing, and then, make decisions on how it wants to pursue its priorities.
Yes, I notice in paragraph 26 here, submission, you say that there is agreement on what housing providers need to make progress on, but a wide gulf between the perceived benefits of housing investment achieving the national targets and outcomes and actually measuring progress. And you talk about the links in the previous paragraph to the impact on the NPF as being hard to measure.
Yeah, I mean, as I think I said earlier in my comments, because the 16 national outcomes they're quite broad, so in a way you could take any one of them and say that investment in social housing contributes to meeting those needs. So for example, the objective that we realise our full economic potential with better employment opportunities, you can then say, well, investing either in building new houses or improving energy efficiency has a very high multiplier effect and produces jobs and training opportunities. But on the other hand, I'm not sure at the moment how easy it is for each of those objectives to then actually measure what did, say, £5 million of investment in this area actually achieve, and that was really why we suggested further development of the work by the Housing Policy Advisory Group.
Okay. Amanda, followed by Kim.
Thank you. I think when we responded to this particular question, we were responding on the basis of thinking on a national level and whether we could see at a national level how the performance framework was impacting on spending. And I'm sure if we dug deep enough down into the www.scotland.gov.uk, we would find all of that, but it's not that explicit. And when you go into the National Performance Framework, similarly, I think in the way that community planning partners are being asked to align their resources with the National Community Planning Partnership outcomes and then our own local priority outcomes, it would be helpful to get an indication of how the National Performance Framework is impacting on the spending decisions of the government through that approach. And I'm not suggesting by any means that we'd want to go back to things like ring-fenced funding or anything like that, but I think it would be useful to get an indication of where something is a spending priority, where is that fitting with the National Performance Framework.
Okay, thank you, Kim.
Thank you for that. Just to obviously thank Jean that her constituency obviously provides some of the best outdoor and adventurous activity opportunities in the world. So sport's really big up there. So that's great. I think the point that was being made earlier by Amanda, and I think that David's made really strongly, is around part of the challenges that are impacts on investment in one area provide outcomes across a range of the different performance indicators. And I think that's a challenge in how we measure some of that. And I think the point that Jean made really strongly around some of our other colleagues, which we would wholeheartedly support in the voluntary sector, is around almost those volunteering activities which are a vehicle, for want of a better phrase. So yes, some people participate in sport because they want to have fun and some of them they enjoy it. But some people, yes, it does provide diversionary activities. It does provide outcomes for education. It does provide other things through being a vehicle. And I would wholeheartedly argue that our colleagues in culture, heritage, the environment, so many other aspects of volunteering activity would do exactly that. So I think it's how we measure and monitor some of that. So looking again, as I've touched on briefly, and I know we mentioned in our submission some of the other outcomes. So there's only one outcome for sport and physical activity through increasing physical activity. But if you start to think about skill profiles, educational attainment, the number or proportion of young people in learning, training or work, graduates with positive life choices, improving in mental health, premature mortality, active travel. When you start to reel off some of those, the link through many voluntary activities is very strong. I guess it's the physical activity and sport aspect of health that we would argue that sport is strongest, but wholeheartedly recognise Jean's points around when you're asking about mental health skill development across the voluntary sector, there's a huge case to be made, so I would wholeheartedly support that. But I think that's the question around some of that cross-departmental working, some of that cross-agency working and budgeting and partnerships, and saying, well, actually, if we invest in area A, it might have an impact on indicator B, but actually it's also going to have an indicator on an impact on the next 12 indicators. And how are we actually actively measuring the contribution that those, as I say, vehicles, for want of a better phrase, have? And I don't think, from a sports point of view, that we've cracked that nut at all. That, as the figures that we've referred to earlier, I don't think we've understood entirely as yet around research the contribution that makes. And I would echo that strongly from our colleagues in other aspects of the voluntary sector, that again, the contribution that's being made isn't recognised across all of the different indicators, exactly as David was saying, that we've recognised. One other quick point, Convener, if that's okay. You made a strong point at the beginning about how things are funded. There's a question for me, and I don't know the answer, but obviously, as I mentioned earlier, currently 161.2 million pounds is in delivery of the Commonwealth Games in 2014, which obviously will cease as a budget line following the Games. So I think there's an opportunity to look at actually sport being the recipient of some of that funding as we go on. Unfortunately, we weren't successful in the 2018 bid for the Youth Olympic Games. So again, there's been pots of funding which have been ring-fenced for sport for opportunities around elite events. Now, absolutely want to keep going with elite events and the positive impact that we can demonstrate they have on participation in certain areas. But I think there's opportunities in looking at some of that budget to say, okay, let's look at a different focus in sport slightly and say, well, actually, you know, prevention, looking at where there are opportunities to work in partnership and make some savings. There are going to be freer lines in budgets, I suppose, as an overarching theme convener that we think there'd be an opportunity for sport to do a little bit more within.
Okay, John.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, a lot of the theme of this is how can we be more joined up, and I think I'm hearing from the local authorities and probably from sport as well that they want to be joined up with what the government's trying to do, and we're all going to try and work together better. And the contrast to that, just when I was looking at the SFHA paper, and especially in procurement, it sounds like the housing associations don't want to be part of this bigger kind of model. Could you maybe just explain to me why you don't want to be part of that?
I should preface my comments by saying I'm not an expert on procurement, or it's not an area I deal with, but I think the concern, if there is one, I hope it doesn't come across as any more than that. And our submission is, while we're keen to achieve better value and to work together with local authorities and other bodies to achieve good value for money, there can be equally a concern sometimes that if procurement becomes a huge issue and following procurement guidelines, whether it's European guidelines or Scottish Government guidelines, it can sometimes, firstly, it can limit activity on the ground. So, for example, I know with the Home Energy Efficiency Programme for Scotland, which is something the SFHA and others campaigned for, and we absolutely welcome the Scottish Government's investment in this area. I know that at the moment local authorities are experiencing delays in actually getting investment in the ground to improve the energy efficiency of their homes and of homes in the private sector. And that's purely down to the time it takes sometimes for local authorities and others to go through a procurement process. The second concern our members sometimes have around procurement is that sometimes in going through large procurement exercises, and this comes up sometimes in discussions on the energy company obligation funding that comes from utility companies, is that sometimes if an approach is taken that you want to have a large-scale procurement to get best value for money, there can sometimes be a danger of small people or small companies working in local communities that actually provide benefits and jobs and employment, either not getting the opportunity to take part in schemes or only taking part in schemes as a subcontractor to a much larger organisation. So I would say if there was concerns from our organisation and our members that's in that area, that's not to say that we're not absolutely keen to procure well and to save money. And for example, a number of our members were involved in a energy switching pilot run by Changeworks, which operates around eastern Scotland and southern Scotland, and that allowed a lot of tenants of housing associations and local authorities to gain access to better energy deals. So I don't want it to come across as we're against working on procurement. I suppose it's just being proportionate and allowing the chance for localism and local firms to benefit.
Just, I suppose, you know, in this part of this joined-up approach and things like, I mean, I know there's a lot of hopes from the procurement bill that may not actually happen, but things like rolling out the living wage, which is one of the hopes for it, you know, that would be of benefit. It would help people's health. They could afford to join a sports club. A lot of these things we're talking about today. I mean, are you saying that on that kind of issue, housing associations are already signed up to it or whatever?
I know certainly a number of our members are signed up to the living wage, and I think that's something we generally promote. I mean, really our members came into being often to address poor housing conditions, whether it was through private landlords or in some cases local authorities in the long past. But what they do is not just about housing. You know, it's about serving some of the poorest communities and some of the poorest people in society. So absolutely, we wouldn't want not to support that sort of initiative and not to gain those sort of benefits. I mean, I hope it comes across in our submission or when we meet with government that associations are about more than housing. It's about much wider activities that benefit the local community.
Thanks so much.
Okay, no one else has indicated that they wish to speak, so we've got 10-15 minutes left, so I just want to go around the table, so to speak, for our guests and see if anyone has got any final kind of points or contributions they want to make that they feel haven't come up in the discussions. Who wants to go first? Eric.
I would just like to probably support what's been said today in terms of collaboration and working closely together, and that's from private sector and from within the public sector. And I think that from SPF's perspective, there needs to be more of that, more collaboration and more openness from both sides. You know, what we struggle with at times is getting to understand and appreciate the pipeline, the forward focus the government has and local authorities have on what the priorities are. You know, there needs to be far more appreciation certainly from our side of what priorities are and how we can support. And certainly, as David mentioned, in localism, you know, our focus has to be on supporting the local people, local communities. You know, from our industry, it's been decimated, and a lot of the local elements of that have gone. And there's a bigger reliance across the whole country in delivering construction, especially through the Hub Initiative now, where you've got, you know, fairly major players taking control of, you know, five areas of Scotland that need to be focused on being able to deliver at a local level, and that's about supporting the local community. Local authorities and certainly government now are driving more of that into the procurement routes, but I think there's still a long way to be gone where we can ensure that we're supporting people at grassroots to support living wage, support communities in growing that. And to do that, we need to have far more transparency and far more appreciation of the challenges that both sides face. So, you know, we'll be proposing that we work as a team to try and deliver a more cohesive approach to certainly supporting communities at a very local level.
I mean, because I know that in paragraph 34 you're missing, you talk about, as you mentioned earlier, new indicators, but to provide a mechanism to assess the time taken to deliver the planned pipeline of publicly funded major construction projects against a defined pipeline. But you also, in terms of measuring performance, which hasn't come up from anyone else, you say that in order for the National Performance Framework to be a truly effective tool, we would recommend a future requirement for performance against the national indicators to be independently assessed via the auspices of an organisation separate from the Scottish Government, such as Audit Scotland.
Again, just sitting listening today, you know, because obviously it's much more at a public sector level, you can hear, you know, the discrepancies in how people are actually viewing and measuring themselves against the indicators, and that to me suggests that, you know, there's something amiss with how we're actually recording and reporting performance at local authority level and at national level. So it'd be good to get, I would suggest, a second opinion, if you like, someone to just review how we're actually recording these key indicators, because they're essential to demonstrate how we are moving forward, and we are moving forward. It's just to get commonality and support across, because I think everyone around the table here is suggesting the same thing. It's just coming across in slightly different format and different appreciation of what we're aiming to achieve. So.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Amanda Coulthard?
I think the two key messages for me that I'm keen we get across, particularly from a Western Bartonshire perspective, but probably across all of the community planning partnerships in Scotland as a community planning manager. The first is that we need to rationalise the the data sources and the indicators that we use to make it as accessible as possible, and to make sure that we are showing a comprehensive picture that we can look across Scotland and start to learn lessons about what's working well in certain areas and share best practice. I think the other one for me, which is a kind of a hearts and minds one, is about the contribution that everybody around the table makes and how we start to analyse and map that contribution and show the valuable input that lots of our voluntary sector organisations make to the outcomes that traditionally would be assigned to public sector organisations. I know that with my community engagement remit, what I hear often from the people, the local residents who are involved in all of our different structures, is they find it really difficult to access information. It's there and it's available to them, but it's not particularly transparent or easy to digest. And I think the more we rationalise and make that accessible for people, the better position we're in as local government organisations and partnerships.
Thank you very much. Amanda Rowe.
I think just to pick up on the point that was being made by Derek, I think if we could get, and also the point being made by Amanda, if we could get closer alignment between the data sets and things like our single outcome agreements are able to more effectively support the National Performance Framework, then we do have existing routes where an independent body almost is looking at them through things like our local area network and our annual assurance statements that are made. They already look at how we are performing in relation to that, so that could then give the assurance that there is consistency across the different agencies. I think that the final point I would want to make from Aberdeenshire Council is that we would want to see Scotland Performs and the National Performance Framework continue, and we would like to see it as something that is a driver within our own strategic planning framework, and that we can demonstrate how we are supporting the delivery of the outcomes, but we would continue to want to be able to set our own local priority outcomes based on the needs that get picked up through our community planning partnership. Thank you.
I'd just like to finish on, yes, supportive of the National Performance Framework and Scotland Performs, but I think one of the most useful exercises we've been through is that Scottish Borders was one of the 3 pilots of community planning audit by Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission last year, and I think the action plan that's derived from that is probably going to be the most helpful for us in the future as to how we take community planning forward and how we measure, because performance monitoring has come up as part of our action plan, and also not to take our eye off the fact that it's about outcomes for our residents of Scottish Borders.
Thank you very much. Kim?
Just a couple, excuse me, just a couple of things, Convener. I'm conscious that one of the aspects that we laid in our submission in trying to recognise some of that wider contribution that people being more physically active impact around it is obviously the great contribution to the economy, which obviously I entirely appreciate is a priority for everybody. But a couple of the figures that we quoted are that work performance increases by 5% when people are more physically active, that you get 27% fewer sick days if people are physically active, and staff turnover is reduced by 15% due to on-site fitness programmes. So there's an aspect to the economy that, again, I don't think we think about, and that I know there's a space for a gym in the building somewhere. I'm never sure if that's been filled with the gym, but I think there are different opportunities that we perhaps don't look in that same way. So I think there's something in there that we maybe haven't touched on as much as potentially we could have. I very much welcome the recognition today that a look at preventative spend is beyond just procurement. Now, I know procurement is really important for a lot of people, and I have no issue with that at all. But the contribution that great chunks of the voluntary sector, so ourselves, our colleagues in culture, in the environment, in heritage, would all say there are different aspects that we bring to the prevention agenda that aren't simply about procurement. So I think that's a really important point that I don't want to forget. I think when we look at how we make some of that culture change, which ultimately from, I guess, a prevention and then with our sort of sports hats on, we're looking at fundamentally the biggest impact area is getting people who are inactive to be active. So there's, I believe, about a 20% difference around that activity between people who are inactive and people who are active. And that's a big bridge to get a big gap to bridge there. But it is about targeting investment in those programmes which demonstrate already that they are making measurable and sustainable impacts. And there are programmes out there, but they're on piecemeal bits of funding. It's a little bit here and a little bit there, where there is research that exists that shows that contributions and differences can be made. But it is about investing, and it's about investing in those specific programmes which are targeted to make those differences. And I think there's a different kind of opportunity there. We've touched a little bit on early intervention. I know it won't surprise many of you here to say that's a massive issue. From our point of view, our aspiration is there's an entitlement for physical activity, and there's an entitlement for what we would call physical literacy. So if every young person can run, jump, throw, catch and swim from a very early age, they sound like the basics because they are, But if every young person has a foundation to do that, then they can enjoy a lifelong participation in physical activity of whatever kind they would like. But if you don't have those fundamentals at an early age within school life, then you may never achieve the opportunities. And those opportunities are hopefully for fun, but they're hopefully for life-saving, and they're hopefully for cost-saving in later life. So the early intervention aspect is fundamental from our point of view, but there's an access opportunity to a wide range of opportunities for people to be active, and that's a fundamental part. I do believe fundamentally, and I'll find genes, but that there is an opportunity for a sport for everybody. I think there's a different kind of activity that different people can participate in, but that diversity and that breadth is incredibly important, and that should be celebrated as part of the number of different sports clubs that we have in this country. I think around our submission around legacy, and I think that's really important today as well, is around a sustainable infrastructure. So it's providing accessible opportunities for all people to get involved, and again, that's focusing on those inactive people. The framework that we've frequently proposed, and apologies for those that have heard it before, it is a four-strand. It's PE, people, places and performance. So it's that young people are physically active at school through attaining physical literacy, and through whereby people being physically active is just normal. It's just the cultural norm, and they believe that's right. It's about more support for our coaches and our volunteers, the 195,000 people who volunteer week in, week out, month in, month out in sport in this country to make it happen. Half of all young people who want to volunteer in sport. So when we talk about skills, when we talk about life chances, it's enormous. Places, so it's accessible opportunities. We've talked an awful lot about the school estate, and that is unashamedly a plug for the next cross-party group on sport meeting, where we are talking about access to the school estate and what that looks like, and some of our partners obviously from local authorities will be part of that as well. But the cost of access to facilities is a real barrier. We hear back from clubs around people being more active. Now, I know that's a massive challenge and a pressure for local authority budgets, but wouldn't there be a great aspiration if a facility has been received public funding, that it would be free for community clubs? Now, that's beyond sports clubs. I know sports club would be my interest, but if public money has been invested in a facility, wouldn't it be great if there's an aspiration that we could throw open those doors for the voluntary sector in all different guises to say, let's get more people involved, because we recognise the prevention opportunity that would provide. And performance is our other one. Through the successes we've already seen through 2012 in the Olympics and the Paralympics, and we're bound to see in when we look towards 2014 and the number of events beyond, the contribution that makes to people being active, to the success of this country, to the reputation of this country, are enormous. So they were our sort of four pitches, if that makes sense, around where we would also invest money. Fundamentally, I think it's that match that we mentioned between the health objective and what that looks like from what the Chief Medical Officer says. It's an obvious mismatch in my mind, and hopefully so in your minds as well. But I think it's about that courage you mentioned earlier, convener, who's recognising these benefits, and let's have the courage to look beyond what is a parliamentary cycle and a governmental cycle and say we can make this country a better place, and there are different aspects that can help to that.
Thank you. David, the final word is with you.
Thank you very much. If I could just make a couple of points very briefly. I think really in common with what others have said, we'd like to emphasise the importance of preventative spend. And obviously we feel housing has an important role to play in this. To give a couple of brief examples, investing in the energy efficiency of housing can improve educational attainment. It's got knock-on benefits for both physical and mental health, but it's also a great boost for the economy. There was a recent report from Consumer Futures that was prepared by Cambridge Econometrics, who said that investing in energy efficiency in housing was the most effective way of stimulating the economy. It was done for the UK government, but there's going to be a similar exercise looking specifically at Scotland. Second example is really to do with older people. We're obviously, like all Western countries, facing an ageing population. There's going to be a lot of people living longer, living on their own. We feel housing's got a great role to play, whether it's through adaptations, quality service, or providing social and health support in partnership with others, and ensuring that people have a good quality of life. And there would also be benefits by saving spend from acute services.
Thank you very much for that, David. Appreciate that. And I'd like to thank all our witnesses for their strong contributions this morning. I'm now going to suspend the session until 11:35 to allow witnesses to leave and new witnesses to come in, and to give members of the committee an actual break. Thank you. looks we're all here, so I will call the session back to order. Our third item of business today is to take evidence on the Auditor-General for Scotland's report, Developing Financial Reporting in Scotland. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting today Caroline Garner, the Auditor-General for Scotland, who is joined by Gemma Diamond and Mark Taylor from Audit Scotland. And can I invite Caroline to make a brief opening statement? Caroline.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for inviting us to present this report to the committee. It obviously covers a number of areas that are central to the committee's role and responsibilities, and we're glad of the chance to be here with you today. The devolved Scottish public sector manages and delivers public services that are crucial for almost every aspect of the lives of Scotland's people. The public sector spends more than £45 billion a year from a variety of sources, including the Westminster Block Grant and council tax. Comprehensive, reliable and transparent financial information is necessary to help politicians and other decision makers to make good decisions about how that money is used, to hold public bodies to account for their spending, and to ensure that there's public confidence in the management and sustainability of the public finances. As the committee is aware, the Scotland Act will shortly give ministers new tax and borrowing powers aimed at increasing autonomy and strengthening accountability. Those powers also raise the prospect of more variable revenues in future. This will increase the importance of managing and accounting for the public finances in a way that demonstrates financial stability and potentially builds investor confidence on the bond markets in future. It's important for me to stress that there is a lot that's good about public financial management in Scotland at the moment, but the changing environment will bring new demands. Currently, much of the government's financial reporting and the Parliament's own consideration focuses on spending against annual resources and capital budgets. That's undoubtedly a critical area, but the Scotland Act will bring a new focus on revenue, and the report also highlights the importance of comprehensive, transparent and reliable information on the assets and liabilities that the Scottish public sector holds. Understanding the risks and opportunities that are associated with those assets and liabilities is essential to sustainable public finances. The report in front of you pulls together information from around 100 sets of accounts of Scottish public bodies for 2011-12 to illustrate what assets and liabilities are held and the opportunities and risks that they present. We found that the devolved Scottish public sector has assets of approximately £86 billion, including hospitals, schools and investments in loans and shares, and liabilities of approximately £94 billion, including pensions and borrowings. It's important to note that the valuation of assets and liabilities always represents a snapshot at a single point in time, and it often requires significant judgment and use of best estimates. Effective financial reporting helps complex issues like this to be understood so that the financial risk can be well managed. In terms of where there's room for improvement, we think there are two big broad areas. The first is that there's currently no published picture of the assets and liabilities of the Scottish public sector as a whole, although ministers do have powers under Section 20 of the Public Finance and Accountability Act to prepare consolidated public accounts that would provide this. We think that Scotland's increasing financial autonomy with the implementation of the Scotland Act offers a good opportunity for the Parliament and the Scottish Government to consider whether such accounts should be introduced. Secondly, we also suggest 4 specific areas where financial reporting could be developed. The first of these is how best to report the long-term consequences of investment decisions, including the use of borrowing and public-private partnerships to fund investment in assets. Secondly, the Scottish Government will also have to consider how best to report on how its forecasts and other estimates are made as the new tax-raising powers are used. It's important that it can show these forecasts are soundly based and explain the reasons for any variance between actual and estimated tax receipts and the impact that variance has on the public finances. Thirdly, audited accounts include the identification of potential future liabilities, and we think there's scope for the Scottish Government to ensure that there's clear monitoring and reporting on these potential liabilities so that the associated risks can be managed. Fourth and finally, the Scottish Government could provide more transparent information on some complex accounting areas, like adjustments to the block grant, that can be difficult for both the Scottish Parliament and the public to understand. In summary, Convener, the report highlights the importance of transparent, comprehensive and reliable financial information in building public trust and investor confidence, supporting accountability and providing the information needed to make sound decisions. The changing financial environment in Scotland means that now's a good time for the Government and the Parliament to consider how financial reporting could be further developed, and this report is intended to be a constructive contribution to that debate. Convener will do our best to answer any questions you and your colleagues may have.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that interesting opening statement. As is normally the case with the Finance Committee, I'll ask some opening questions and I'll open this session out to colleagues around the table. One of the things you touched on, of course, was forecasting, and it's obviously important that the Government and the OBR can show forecasts are actually soundly based. But in May of this year, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment, Sustainable Growth indicated Scotland would require its own independent forecasting unit. Do you believe this is the appropriate vehicle for doing so, and what role do you see for yourself in terms of that?
We made a response to the committee's consultation on that question earlier this year, Convener. And in broad terms, clearly the vehicle which the government chooses to put in place for forecasting is a matter of policy, rather than one in which we would have a direct view. We do think, though, that a separate body of the nature that's been put forward would certainly be in a good position to fulfil the requirements for forecasting, the way in which it works in practice, the transparency of its forecasts, and the way in which it builds the capacity to fulfil that critical function in future, I think are the issues that now need attention. They could be fulfilled in various ways, could certainly be fulfilled through the body that's been envisaged by the Cabinet Secretary, and we'll be keeping a close eye as the establishment of the body is developed to make sure it is in a position to provide those forecasts effectively.
You forgive me for asking you to dip your toe into policy. It's a kind of sneaky thing that politicians do at these kind of occasions, and your predecessor was always very wary, in actual fact, in that regard, so it's understandable you are too. But I'm just wondering, though, if you feel that that in terms of the kind of devolved taxes through the 2012 Scotland Act, if you feel that the OBR's forecasting is robust, because that's one of the reasons that the Cabinet Secretary has given for setting up this independent body.
You're right. As Auditor General, I always have to be very concerned not to overstep the marks and comment on policy. And I don't think at the moment we have the evidence that would be needed to draw any conclusions about the quality of the OBR's forecasting of the future Scottish devolved taxes under the Scotland Act. We do think it's obviously critical that those forecasts both are robust and are transparent, so that they can be tested and challenged by the Parliament and by others with an interest. We're fortunate, I think, in that the implementation of the Scotland Act gives us a good run-up to test out the forecasts in practice before the Scottish Government's finances start to rely on them. And we're keeping a close eye on that, as well as on the Scottish Government's plans for how it might establish its own forecasting capability in future.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, you talked about clarifying complex accounting issues, and of course, as you mentioned, the Scottish Government does contain several complex areas, such as, for example, the accounting treatment of student loans. And in paragraph 16 of your report, you say that, and I quote, "The Scottish Government and other public sector bodies produce audited accounts. They do so individually. It would require the consolidation of over 100 sets of accounts with appropriate adjustments for transactions between public bodies to determine the assets and liabilities of the devolved Scottish public sector as a whole." I mean, how long would such a process take, and what kind of cost implications do you think there would be for carrying out that process?
I'll ask my colleague Mark Taylor to come in a moment to give you more information about that, but it's worth noting that currently the UK Government does produce whole-of-government accounts to which the Scottish Government makes a significant contribution. So lots of the groundwork is already in place. What we're not seeing is that comprehensive picture for Scotland being pulled together up until now. Mark, could you take us through that in a bit more detail?
Thank you. I'll do my best to do so. I think just to pick up with the starting point, which is there are already a number of mechanics in place to prepare whole-of-government accounts at a UK level. It provides some of the vehicles to get consistency of accounting approach and consistency of reporting to allow aggregation, to allow consolidation. It's undoubtedly the case that there would be additional cost requirements on top of that to prepare public accounts for Scotland. I guess the issue at question is the cost-benefit analysis of that. we are very clear that the real benefit that public accounts could bring in a changing environment with the introduction of the powers in the Scotland Act. But we're also clear that the purpose of this report is to start a discussion of that and to start a discussion of the costs and of the benefits, and for us and the Scottish Government to continue and maintain that discussion.
Thank you. I mean, quite interested in, again, you touched on assets and liabilities, and in paragraph 20 of your report you say that councils currently value local roads at their historical cost, whereas Transport Scotland values its trunk roads at depreciated replacement costs. And if councils were to value roads during the same methodology as Transport Scotland, they estimate the value of these assets would increase from £5 to £55 billion. Now, quite clearly, that has a significant impact on Scotland's perceived asset base. I'm just wondering if you think there should be consistency in terms of this.
The different accounting frameworks, you're quite right, have a significant impact in this particular case on the valuation of the assets, and it's why we've been very careful to put forward our estimate of the total assets and total liabilities as just that, an estimate that can't be taken further in the absence of full whole-of-government accounts for Scotland. Greater consistency on the accounting standards is something that the accounting profession in general and across government is working towards. Mark may have some more to say to you about the specific application in relation to roads there.
Just to add to that, to say that the roads issue is well understood and work's well underway to address it through time, and the estimate that we've used in the report is an estimate that comes from the profession itself. They're very well aware of the issue and working hard to address it, and we'd expect it to be addressed through time and bring that consistency.
Okay, I'm going to open the session out to colleagues in a second. I just want to ask one more question before I do so, because I've already got 4 colleagues wanting to come in. Paragraph 68, you say the Scottish Government could look to examples from around the world to see how it might further develop its financial reporting. And you do in your report actually mention some of these, but I'm just wondering if you can talk to that for a wee minute or two, just for the committee record.
Certainly. As I said in my opening remarks, it's clear that here in the UK and in Scotland, we do a lot of the financial reporting very well. For example, government financial statements are produced on an accruals basis, which means that they actively match income and expenditure in time. They now use the same financial reporting standards that are used for large corporations in the private sector. We do a lot of things very well. What we are keen to promote the debate about is how that can develop in the context of further financial autonomy for Scotland, to give that whole picture of assets and liabilities, and to really draw out the things that you need as politicians, as decision makers, as people scrutinising the Scottish Government's performance, to understand the implications of decisions being made now. New Zealand is one of the countries which is seen to do this very well at the moment. There are other exemplars who do either most things well, Australia is another country that does it well, or have got particular pockets of good practice. We certainly aren't pointing to any one model and saying this is the way it ought to be. I think it's important that is a dialogue with the government and with Parliament. But there are things we can learn from both countries who are seen as being exemplars of good practice, like Australia and New Zealand, or countries who've had a particular experience which has highlighted their concerns. And one we mention in the report here is the experience of the Spanish government. We've all heard a lot in the news recently about the problems facing the Spanish government with the level of indebtedness they've built up. In Spain, the problem wasn't the borrowing that the Spanish government itself undertook. It was the borrowing that had been entered into by regional governments, which wasn't clear and transparent and brought together anywhere, that suddenly became unaffordable when the financial crisis hit and local tax revenues fell very sharply. That's a really good example of the sorts of risks that any country can run if it doesn't have that clear picture of the overall assets and liabilities that it may have to manage. So that's the sort of international experience that we think there's scope to learn from in taking this debate forwards.
Okay, thank you for that. So we'll now open up the session, and the first person to ask questions will be Malcolm, to be followed by Gavin.
I mean, that was interesting, your last example of the international experience, because I was wondering whether the fact that there had been no published picture in Scotland was a function of our constitutional arrangements, but obviously it's not entirely that, but I wonder if it's partly related to that. I mean, I suppose I wanted to ask mainly about liabilities, but perhaps rather a naive question about assets, you know, because I think everyone will understand the importance of having knowledge about liabilities, but when it comes to assets and such a wide discrepancy on the roads, I mean, what is the significance in that sense of knowing your assets if there is such an enormous variation on the possible way of describing them?
I think that the roads one, as Marcus said, is an evolving picture. There is now an agreement for how we'll move the valuation of roads onto a consistent basis in future, and that will make both the value of the road holdings more transparent and help to put in context, for example, the amount of backlog for maintaining those roads that we need to be managing over time. Perhaps a better example is of an asset where there isn't as much transparency as we would like to see, is around the valuation of student loans, a very significant asset of the Scottish Government, not always obvious as an asset to lay people, but the clarity about what those loans are worth, how over what period of time they're likely to be repaid, and therefore the income stream associated with them, and the extent to which they might be reduced in value by changes in the economy is another example of where greater transparency would help better decision making and a better picture of really what is the financial sustainability of the public finances looking like.
Well, the student debt's an interesting example. So, I mean, is account taken of that, do you think, in terms of the Scottish Government's finances? Because obviously there's quite a risk of bad debt there. I mean, or is that likely to be over a very long period of time, or could it be quite significant?
I'll ask Gemma to pick the question up and tell you more about the way they're currently accounted for.
Certainly in the accounts there is account taken for the potential that the debt won't be repaid by the student. They have quite a complex assessment that is made right at the start when the loans are made that run through a number of different factors. It's based on a system that the UK uses to model out what loans might not be repaid, and an immediate kind of write down is made at the debt when the loans are made. So that all is taken into account in the accounts. What we're saying through the report is that actually student loans are a very complex accounting mechanism. They appear in the accounts in lots of different places, and that it can be very hard to follow actually how that flows through the accounts, and that greater transparency over this complex area and exactly how it works, exactly what the provision is and how that has been calculated. Some of the assumptions that have been made when making that bad debt provision would enhance the transparency of how the student loans work and enable better scrutiny of the student loans.
I mean, moving on to liabilities, obviously you mentioned both pensions and borrowings, both of which are interesting and important. I mean, I suppose your Spanish example was really quite interesting because I don't know whether anybody keeps an eye in this country. I suppose the Treasury probably does in terms of the borrowings of local government. But is that something that the Scottish Government keeps an eye on? Or?
The Scottish Government takes a series of financial returns from each local authority each year that gives a range of information about their finances, including borrowing. The Accounts Commission, obviously, through the audit of the local authorities, also keeps a close eye on this, and in its overview report each year gives a picture of how borrowing is moving. But it's a very interesting question in terms of the potential risks that come with assets and liabilities, about the way in which the prudential framework that lets local authorities decide how much borrowing they're going to enter into, over what time period, on what interest terms, the way in which all of that comes together to provide a picture of Scotland's public finances as a whole. To be clear, we're absolutely not saying that Scotland is in anything like the position of Spain, but that's a very useful reminder of why it is important to have that overall picture, because if a local authority did get into financial troubles, the Scottish Government would likely have to step in to provide support, even if only to keep the essential services running in the meantime.
And I mean, the pensions one is obviously a big one. I mean, I'm obviously not trying to entice you into constitutional areas, but I do want, in a kind of way, do you think potentially this assets and liabilities issue could become a feature of the debate on the Constitution? Because obviously, you know, there's so much discussion about the future economics of Scotland. I mean, it would seem, I suppose it already has in terms of pensions, but more generally in terms of assets and liabilities, do you foresee that becoming quite an area of discussion in the constitutional debate in the next year potentially?
As you say, it already is part of the debate. Again, going back to the convener's caveat earlier, we need to be very careful how we play into that. We did provide evidence to the Scottish Affairs Select Committee earlier this year about the public sector pension schemes. And what's very interesting there is that most of the pension liabilities and most of the pension scheme members are already in schemes which are devolved to Scotland. The local government schemes, the teachers scheme, the NHS scheme. It's really only the civil service pension scheme which is run on a UK-wide basis. So that particular issue is not a particularly large one in the independence debate or the debate about further devolution of financial responsibility. But given the direction of travel that we're seeing with the Scotland Act, which is already on the statute books, that understanding of the liabilities and what that means for future expenditure and for future revenues is very important for all of us, I think.
Thanks.
Gavin, to be followed by Michael. Thanks, Convener. I suppose I want to focus on what was really your second main point, if you like, in your summary, in relation to forecast estimates and what's actually collected in terms of revenues. Do you have any preliminary views on what sort of financial oversight there ought to be, and really how frequently should revenue collection be reported? Should it be transparently reported in real time, monthly, quarterly, annually? Do you have any preliminary views on how that might work with the new taxes coming in?
Mark Taylor, who leads the Scottish Government annual audit, is staying very close to this on my behalf, and I'll ask him to talk you through that in a bit more detail in a moment. Sure. I think our starting point, though, is that there is scope to talk about good practice in terms of that real-time reporting going on, but it's unarguable that we will need to have annual reporting of how the receipts do match against forecasts, what that means for the government's annual outturn, whether it's above or below the budget that it expected to have, and therefore what that means for future spending and tax-raising plans. So that will need to be had anyway. I'll ask Mark to talk you through where our thinking has got to on the level of reporting beneath that annual unarguable one.
And in terms of forming a view as to how frequent that should be, I don't think we do have a view on that. I don't think we've formed a view on that. In terms of what that reporting should try to achieve, I think very much it's about understanding three things. I think it's about helping an understanding, we've touched on it, about the quality of the forecasting itself and what the level of uncertainty is and what the level of risk that goes with that. It's about understanding, and this is fundamentally important to our report today, it's about understanding what the implications of that are for budgets, how the forecast impacts on the budget, how the block grant impacts on the budget, and how differences between forecasts and actuals impact on the budget. And understanding those implications alongside the implications of other things that impact on the budget exchange mechanism, any capital monies that with agreements being carried from one year to the other, and borrowing, and how all those things interact. And fundamentally what this report's about is about getting clarity over that. That's certainly an annual process, and to my mind it's certainly a process that impacts both at the budget setting stage and at the budget outcome stage of the annual report stage. So I think there's at least two areas where it's worth reporting on that. I think the other area I'd flag here is it's about enabling a whole system picture of things like borrowing and the impact of revenue and the impact of tax, and be able to place those individual things. For example, how does the forecast affect the amount of money we've got available to spend in the context of the wider position of what aggregate borrowing is and what aggregate liabilities are.
I suppose the reason I ask the question is if you take income tax in particular, and you predict this is how much we think we'll collect over the course of the financial year, it's inconceivable that you collect 1/12 of that amount in each calendar month. There will be peaks and troughs, presumably at the end of January and end of the financial year are particularly busy. Other months, presumably, you collect much less. I would imagine. So I just wonder, in terms of the level of sophistication that is required, is there merit in having either monthly or quarterly reporting as against what was predicted, so that we have a good picture of how we're doing as parliamentarians or as a finance committee? You might think 9 months through the year, great, we've got 3/4 of what we expected. But if the last quarter was predicted to be a bumper quarter and it turns out to be a weak quarter, then you end up at the end of the year with some difficulties. So I just wonder, again, do you have any further thoughts on that?
I think it's exactly the sort of question this committee ought to be exploring at this stage. We would certainly expect the Government and Revenue Scotland to have in place very detailed monitoring, which is increasingly informed by a good understanding of what the pattern of tax collection is, how much you would expect to collect in each month of the year, and what action needs to be taken if there's slippage against that. That becomes particularly important in relation to the Scottish rate of income tax, by far the biggest of the new taxes, which will be collected by HMRC on behalf of the government. So having that really clear line of sight will be key for them. I don't think there's been much attention yet on what information the Parliament needs or should be publicly reported in year as opposed to at the end of the year and as part of the budget setting process, as Marcus said. I don't have a strong view on it at this stage, but I think it is something this committee and other committees of the Parliament should be focusing on.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. Michael, to be followed by John.
Ms Gardner, you said in your opening statement about the value of assets, and in response to Malcolm you talked about some of the sort of financial assets, but in point 23 of your report you specifically look at physical assets, and you say that the public sector needs to consider how demand and usage of physical assets affect the condition of future maintenance requirements. And at point 24 you go on to say public bodies may decide to delay short-term expenditure on maintaining assets, and if they do, they must be aware of how this might affect the long-term condition of the assets and the way they are used to support service provision. My question really is, are you aware of an increase in that type of decision?
At the moment, not. There clearly is a risk of it, which is why we make the point here in the report. And I guess one of the reasons why that evidence isn't there is because public bodies are becoming more transparent in reporting their maintenance backlog. So we report in paragraph 23 about the NHS maintenance backlog, which is based on a very detailed survey carried out by the NHS of its assets, breaking down the maintenance requirements by category and more recently separating out the amount which is a lower priority because the buildings are likely to be disposed of within the next 10 years. So the information is improving, which is a good thing. It's not yet good enough to be able to really highlight whether the backlog maintenance is increasing because people are making the decision to delay repair or investment and running the risk of storing up problems for the longer term as a result of it. But that's exactly why we think the information is needed on a consistent basis so that the bodies themselves can spot that and so that the Parliament can see the impact of that if it is happening.
I assume from what you're saying that it must be really important to get a baseline so that when maintenance costs are taken into account later, you can then contrast that with how much the cost of maintenance would have been at the time when a decision was deferred.
That's exactly right, and I think that baseline is developing. We've got a range of examples here related to NHS assets, to the roads network, to other things. That baseline is there. We now need to be using that baseline information both in the individual public bodies and the Scottish Government and here in the Parliament to look for those sorts of patterns. What's happening to the backlog maintenance costs, which we know we have? What are the plans for meeting them? How does that fit into things like planning for reconfiguring services to move from reacting to problems to preventing them? All of that information is very necessary for making those sorts of decisions.
Thank you, Michael. John, to be followed by Jamie.
Thanks, Convener. In part 3, specifically paragraph 47, you talk about the audited accounts and how they are a key way of reporting financial information. And then you say international accounting frameworks and standards help to ensure that they are prepared objectively and can be compared across different organisations. However, this can mean they're hard to understand by a lay reader, if not impossible. I mean, this is not just an issue for the public sector, is it? I mean, this is absolutely across all accountancy, and accountants have failed to make accounts understandable, haven't they?
That's a very topical debate, as I know you're aware, Mr Mason, around the impact that the international financial reporting standards have had, on the one hand in terms of making accounts more comparable, more consistent, but on the other, many people would argue making them less understandable and perhaps less useful in some contexts. Clearly, it has been a major investment of time and resources for governments across the world to bring their financial reporting in line with IFRS, and there are some benefits to it, but there is a strong school of thought which I understand that it's made them less comprehensible. I am an accountant and I can pick up the accounts of a local authority and spend quite some time trying to work out really what they're telling me. This report is intended as a contribution to discussing really what are the most important things that the users of accounts need to know. There's then a second step, which is so how do we get that in place? My sense is that trying to argue from here that the international financial reporting standards need to change is going to be a long and slow process. But there are things that we can do in terms of providing commentary on the accounts, linking the financial statements to things like Scotland Performs, a range of things that can be done to build on that foundation, but to make them more useful and more approachable for lay users, rather than running the risk of adding to that complexity and putting people off.
So is that the kind of thing that New Zealand are doing? It's more that on the kind of commentary side or the presentational side, the actual content is much the same as everywhere else?
Absolutely. They still apply the international financial reporting standards. What they have got very good at, very skilled at doing, is providing that commentary and providing a long-term look at financial sustainability based on what they know from this year's financial statements.
Okay, thanks. I mean, transparency gets a good bit of coverage and, you know, on the whole, I think most of us are keen on transparency. Although when you get into the whole area of provisions and contingent liabilities and things, there's also a bit of a kind of balance, isn't there, between not telling your opponent exactly what your hand of cards is. And we look here at contingent liabilities in private generally because they are sensitive. How do we get that balance between, you know, not just saying, well, we're about to pay out 10 million for this claim, which would in fact encourage the claim?
You're absolutely right, and the same issue, I think, relates to reporting the likely costs of large capital investments before the contract's committed. Nobody wants to be showing their hand to the person on the other side of the table before that deal is done. That doesn't mean there can't be more transparency about what the likely liabilities are. It's a difficult question because I don't want to give the impression that sort of with 20/20 hindsight, things which became apparent should have been known at the time. If we were sitting here 6 years ago, none of us would have guessed that the UK government could have such a large liability for the failing banks. We couldn't have seen that coming. But equally, I think there is a process of saying, given what we now know about the bank bailouts, about what's happened in the Eurozone, in Spain and in other countries with liabilities that have fallen to government, what's happening to some US cities like Detroit, what does that mean for the likely liabilities or the possible liabilities which could fall to the Scottish Government or public bodies, and are we monitoring those in ways that help us to manage them and disclosing them as contingent liabilities where that's appropriate? Of course, the benefit of contingent liabilities is that you don't have to put a number on them because they're less than 50-50 in terms of the likelihood of crystallising. You're talking about the risk rather than the financial impact. I think the point we're trying to promote is the importance of having that discussion in quite an open way about what possible liabilities might be before they crystallise, so that we can take a prudent and responsible approach to managing the public finances.
I mean, one specific example you touch on yourselves is the equal pay cases, which I think is primarily not Scottish Government or Parliament, but is primarily local councils and NHS boards. I mean, I don't think you make a particular recommendation on that, unless I missed it, but I mean, that's a kind of example where legally we're probably not responsible, but there is a potential liability down the line. Is that the case?
In technical terms, that's absolutely right. And it's a very good example of how difficult it can be to quantify what the liability is. As we all know, equal pay cases have been running for a long time right across the UK. And every time the bodies involved think they're getting closer to being able to quantify what the liability is, a new legal decision emerges which changes that in different directions. So the ability to hold it as a contingent liability and to be aware of what the impact might be without either revealing a negotiating position to lawyers or providing spurious accuracy about what the liability might be is very important in that context. I think Mark may want to come in from his body language. I think he's got more to say there, so I'll check if there's something you want to add.
Just round that out a little bit. I think a key point here is the difference between showing a hand on individual cases and dealing with the aggregation of the sort of issues that are out there that may potentially lead to expenditure down the line. I think there's opportunities to be more transparent, perhaps, about some of the underlying issues. In terms of some of the niceties on equal pay, I think individual bodies make individual accounting judgments about whether to recognise that expenditure and how much expenditure to recognise on a best estimate basis. Different parts of the public sector have made different judgments about that. That's something that's picked up through the audit process and confirmed through the audit process. You asked earlier about audited accounts. I think an important point to say about audited accounts, there's a lot of information that's in the public domain and made available to this committee and to the Parliament. The unique aspect of audited accounts is that they are audited and that they are independently verified and prepared to an objective framework. In the case of contingent liabilities and provisions, that's one of the ways in which we as auditors test what should be reported against the rules and what's able to be less transparent.
I mean, just to kind of expand on that a wee bit, I mean, I take your point that you know, we don't want to be totally transparent about an individual transaction and what the liability might be, but it's more the overall picture. But I mean, one of the things we've just been looking at recently was bringing together the health service and the social work service, and then the thought that individual employees, once they start getting mixed up with each other, there's the potential for a lot of equal pay claims in there. Now, on one hand, we don't want to be actually encouraging people to, on day one, immediately make an equal pay claim, but on the other hand, we have a responsibility to be open about that and transparent about that. I mean, how can we get the balance right in that?
I would say that example is one where the financial reporting implications come quite a long way down the road. The most important thing for me is being aware, as we already are, that equal pay can be a significant cost to public bodies, and of course is a real issue of social justice and fair treatment of individual workers. Getting that planning in now to understand what it means as you bring people from different employment backgrounds, different roles, different grading structures together, and thinking through how to manage the impact of that on the service and on the cost of services is something that should be central to the planning for the integration of health and social care. If that's done properly, then the liabilities are much easier to manage than if it's something which emerges as an afterthought once the integration has taken place. So it's a great example of why the awareness of the potential liabilities is very important, and the financial reporting of those follows further down the line.
Thank you. Just a slightly separate subject, we talked a little bit borrowing and how the local authorities have the prudential borrowing power, and in paragraph 35 you talk about how the Scottish Government will be limited by this, especially by the idea of no more than 5% of estimated capital and revenue budgets would go in paying the interest, basically, and paying loans and so on. I mean, I realise there's a kind of policy issues in here as well, but I mean, the 5% would appear to be quite arbitrary, and I'm more comfortable with the prudential approach. Can you make any comment on what our risks are in there?
A broad comment, I think. I think that the important underlying point, as your question is hinting, is how do we make sure that financing capital investment through revenue means is affordable in the long term. There's nothing wrong with doing it in principle. We all do it when we buy a house on a mortgage. There's no reason not to finance your capital investment through revenue sources, but it does tie up funding for a long period of time, 20 and 30 years, and throws up questions of the affordability of future requirements and the sort of intergenerational equity question. So there are different approaches that can be taken to ensuring that financial sustainability. The prudential framework is the one that's been agreed for local government across the UK. The Scottish Government took the initiative of setting a 5% cap. I think setting the cap is a good move forward in terms of that ability to demonstrate financial sustainability. It's not the only approach that could be taken, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it, and it's a positive move. The next step we'd like to see the government having made that policy decision is greater clarity about what counts against the cap and more transparent reporting for how it's been used, so that the Parliament and others with an interest can see what's been committed and what's still available for investment over the rolling period that the existing commitments cover.
So, I mean, as interest rates vary and inflation varies in the future, that would have an impact on whether the 5% cap is too high or too low?
It absolutely will, depending on the way in which existing investment has been financed, whether it's fixed rate or variable rate and the other things that are in there. Again, that's why that transparency of reporting what's in the cap and what's been committed against it becomes so important. Being able to take that 30, 40, 50-year view of what's already committed and therefore what's available for investment is very important against that background of change.
That's great, thanks much.
Okay, Jamie, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. In Exhibit 6, which sets out the in graphic format the assets and liabilities of the devolved Scottish public sector, I'm just wondering if you could set out for me, where do these figures come from? I mean, I see the source is Audit Scotland, but is there one single register that you were able to get these from, or does this come through your own assessment and your own work of having to pull it together?
I'll ask Gemma to give you more detail, but in broad terms it comes from our work in pulling together the accounts of more than 100 public bodies in Scotland.
So you are the single source, essentially?
In terms of consolidating it and pulling it together, yes. Gemma, do you want to say a bit more about how we did it?
Absolutely. I mean, in essence, it was a simple kind of consolidation process of adding together all the different sets of accounts for the public bodies involved. And we did have a threshold in place that, whereby some of the smaller bodies weren't included because they wouldn't materially impact on the overall position. So we used the audited accounts and also some whole of government accounts information as well, and basically added them together to get the consolidated picture. We made some adjustments where we knew there would be some double counting in place. So for example, Scottish Government lending to Scottish Water, we tried to remove that from the picture so we weren't double counting. But we know that we weren't able to remove all double counting, that is transactions between public bodies, but we don't believe that they would materially impact on the picture as it is.
That's helpful. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me. This may be quite a convoluted question. It probably comes from my lack of accountancy expertise as much as anything else. See, that's got John intrigued. It's about the definition of what constitutes an asset. From my lay point of view, if you were to ask me what my financial assets were, it's my house, it's my car, it's property that I can have that I can either shift and realise a value through, or I can borrow against. And I see in your glossary you set out what how you define an asset, and I presume that's broadly speaking what you would still consider constitutes an asset in the terminology you used. In that way, I'm intrigued as to how, notwithstanding the wide variation in terms of their value, roads are viewed as an asset. I mean, I can see how they're an economic and a social asset, but in what way are they a financial asset? No one's going to come in and buy Scotland's road network anytime soon, is it?
You're taking us all right back to our Accounting 101 courses for some of us a long time ago, in terms of understanding what an asset is. The definition we've used is one which is standard right across the accounting and auditing profession. And an asset is anything which you can use, which you own or control and can use to produce value. So the roads network has a value in that it's critical, a critical part of Scotland's economic infrastructure for moving people and goods and businesses around the place. And maybe the easiest way of sort of quantifying that is to think that if we had to build the roads network in place, if it didn't go back the 100 and more years that it does in parts of Scotland, there would be a real cost to doing it. We would be investing in building that asset that can then be used to underpin the economy and the social connections that we all have.
I mean, it's not an asset in the sense that I've set. I mean, I missed Accountancy 101, I should say. It's not an asset that, in the sense I've set out then, it's not something that can be used to borrow against or anything like that.
You might be surprised. I'll ask Mark to take you through that.
Surprise me.
Thank you. I think it's worth recognising that there's different types of assets, obviously. I think the assets that you're talking about are ones that provide public benefit, and that public benefit perhaps isn't in the potential to dispose of them and raise proceeds. Other assets are more of that financial asset type where there's a financial value. What the balance sheet does, what the statement of financial position does, is capture both sorts of those assets and puts a value on them. I think through having more transparent reporting, some of those issues, some of the understanding of where opportunities might be to release cash, and where some of the opportunities, where some of the risks might be to the need to fund assets and to maintain assets, better reporting will help a better understanding of those sorts of issues.
Useful point. I want to comment to that, but I think that is helpful clarification, certainly from my perspective. So it includes both assets you could realise you know, value against, and also the wider economic and social leverage they bring in. In terms of the point you made there about, you know, ongoing, because obviously these assets will, some of them, all of them probably will require maintenance, and that is a cost. So in essence, that could that be viewed then as a liability, and as such, in terms of accountancy terms, are the costs that they are likely to incur, are they on the liabilities side?
Again, I'll ask Mark to take you through that, but one of the reasons why we think it's so important to understand assets and to have transparency around them is that they very often do give rise to both costs and income. So roads, over time, to keep them in good order, do require the cost of maintenance and bringing them up to date. But the student loan book, which is also an asset, although as an accountancy student I remember scratching my head over how a loan could be an asset, brings in a revenue stream over time. So that's an example of an asset that brings you income coming in. That clarity is why it's so important. I'll ask my expert here to take you through a bit more of the background to that.
I'll try getting into, avoid getting into a detailed lesson on accountancy, but a broad point to make is that both assets and liabilities come with risks and opportunities, and it's tempting often to see the downside, it's tempting often to see the cost without seeing the benefit, and I think that applies both to assets and to liabilities. And I think through improved financial reporting, the niceties of that for individual classes of assets can be better understood, that sometimes a liability has been measured at a level where there's some uncertainty about that level, and perhaps it will come in at less than that, and perhaps it will free up some additional funds. So there are opportunities and risks associated with both assets and liabilities.
That's helpful, but just for absolute purposes of clarity, you know, the ongoing maintenance costs, where does that feature? Does it feature in this exhibit at all, or?
So just now to drop into accountancy speak, I think it's important to differentiate between liabilities, which are costs that essentially already have been incurred because of the activity of government, and those are liabilities, and future costs, future commitments, which will feature as future expenditure in future years. Those are two separate things.
Your answer is no.
No.
They're not. Okay, that's helpful. I thank the committee's indulgence in my personal accountancy class.
Indeed. Michael's got a supplementary in this area.
A supplementary is to help indulge me a bit, to follow on from where Jamie was. I mean, I recall a period some time ago, I don't know whether this was actually followed through, but some English local authorities were looking at doing sort of PFI deals in terms of their road network assets, where they would borrow on the strength of the road network asset and then pay a company to maintain the road for a set period of time. Is that the type of thing that you're talking about here? Yeah.
That's a great example, and that's when I referred to maybe surprising you. Those assets can sometimes be used in those ways. I don't know of any examples where English local authorities actually did effectively sort of sell off and then lease back their roads network, but it certainly has happened with office buildings and other building type assets where the capital receipt comes in and then there's a revenue cost to continue using the asset over a period of time. Again, that's why it's important to have that picture of what you own and what you owe.
Okay, that's helpful.
Jean.
Thank you, Kavina. I'm kind of on the same theme, really, on the financial reporting of relating to assets and liability and clarity of financial reporting. But just thinking of the kind of examples we've been talking about just now are recorded through local authorities and so on. What about assets that are, for example, the Crown Estate, and how do you or do you look at that? I mean, up until less than 10 years ago, the Crown Estate used to publish Scottish accounts. It no longer does that. It's just for the United Kingdom. And also, kind of following on from that, the OBR, I think, have, in this committee's experience, predicted figures that were clearly not right, and so in the light of the new taxes and so on, how do you have an opinion about that? Do you have a relationship with the OBR? How does that work?
Let's start with the first question about the Crown Estate and other UK-wide assets and liabilities. What we've done for this report very deliberately is to stick with the existing boundary of devolution, with what we have from the 1999 legislation and from the Scotland Act, which is now being implemented. And that change seems to us is a good enough reason to be looking at the completeness, the transparency, the accessibility of the financial reporting that's available to you and to the wider people of Scotland. You're right, the Crown Estate isn't part of this, and we haven't attempted to get into the difficult issues like Scotland's share of the national debt or Scotland's share of other assets which are held on a UK basis. Depending on the outcome of the referendum next year, that may become necessary, but it's not my role to start that debate at the moment. We focus very much on the existing boundaries. Worth saying, though, that whatever happens in terms of future financial devolution or autonomy, this would provide a very sound foundation for it, and is important in its own right and as a foundation for future discussions. Your second question was about the OBR forecasts, and I think I can't really amplify the answer I gave to the convener earlier, that clearly at the moment the OBR forecasts are very central to the Scottish Government's forecasting of the receipts from the new devolved taxes. There will be experience over time of how accurate those forecasts are, and there will be the opportunity to supplement or replace them with specifically Scottish forecasts through the new fiscal forecasting body which is being proposed. But I think the important question from our perspective is the way in which it's possible for this committee and the Parliament more widely to compare the forecasts with the actual receipts and to understand why there's a difference. Was it because of poor forecasting? Was it because of changes that couldn't have been foreseen in economic activity? The whole range of things that will come into play. You need to be able to explore that and understand what's happening as a basis for making sure that future forecasts are more reliable.
Yeah, sure.
Just a wee supplementary. On that basis then, the kind of clarity that you're achieving in terms of auditing Scotland's figures seems not to be true at United Kingdom level. If we, I mean, the OBR, for example, didn't know there was no division made in terms of Scottish figures, Welsh figures, Northern Irish figures or English figures for landfill tax and so on. So that would suggest that there's not the same clarity of that accounting if we can't have these figures for Scotland.
I think I'd distinguish between the financial reporting, which is in a sense sort of looking back at what assets we now hold, what income and expenditure we had over the past year, and making sure that's reported in a way which is comprehensive, transparent, reliable, and forecasting. There are whole of government accounts for the UK government which provide that overall picture and are increasingly useful to the Westminster Parliament in looking at things like the way in which clinical negligence provisions or nuclear decommissioning are being handled. We don't have that yet in Scotland, and I think it would be useful to start looking at how it should develop. We haven't audited the OBR's forecasts either for the UK as a whole or for Scotland, but that is obviously, as you say, something which is becoming more important as the new taxes under the Scotland Act are implemented, and something that the financial reporting will help to inform as it moves forward.
Malcolm, you want to come in again?
Yeah, it was really just to pick up on your statement about greater clarity about what counts against the 5% cap. I wondered really whether, I mean, is there quite a lot of dispute about that, or is this just at the margins, or could you have quite significantly different? I don't know. At the moment, it's 4 point whatever, 8 or 9 or something. I mean, is there scope there for really quite wide discrepancies, or is this just a bit of detail that's lacking?
I think it's the latter. It's the broad picture is clear. There is a need just to pin that out and make it explicit so that the Parliament and others with an interest can see it, and then particularly to report against it on a continuing basis so that we can see what's going on.
Is it not stated clearly at any one point in any document? Is that what you're saying?
The reporting of it is not yet a formal part of the government's financial reporting, although we saw a big step forward in that in the budget announcement a couple of weeks ago. The details of that are still emerging. So it's an evolving picture, but it is the logical next step in the government's good first step of putting the cap in place.
So just in terms of liabilities, I think this is related to this question. So how does, in terms of liabilities, in terms of these different private partnership deals, is it just the however much has to be paid up over the 30 years? Is it just the sum total of all that makes the liabilities? And how does that compare with how you would count the traditional borrowing liabilities? I mean, how do they?
Mark, can you take us through that?
I'll give that one a go. Thank you. I think in terms of the way PPP accounting works is that essentially, yes, you add up the cost of the PPP scheme throughout its lifetime. It's not a straightforward simple aggregation, because then you apply some financial modelling to say what's going to happen to inflation and what's the time value of money, and you're able to estimate the liability. And you would expect through time, of course, as you pay your annual charge, as annual charges are paid by public bodies, that liability to come down. And that's the way in which PPP works. In terms of borrowing, the way borrowing works is, again, the amount of money that you owe to the bank is shown as a liability, and each year you will have to pay some interest costs on that and also repay some of that. In terms of how that impacts on public accounting, there's therefore two things to take account of. One is what's the amount that's still to be paid in aggregate terms, and one thing is how much do we need to pay this year. What the 5% cap is about the how much do we need to pay this year part of that. And what we're saying is that there needs to be absolute clarity about what's in and what's out of that 5% cap. It includes borrowing, it includes PPP costs, but exactly what borrowing and what PPP costs. And I think there's been a helpful discussion about about how that area can be progressed.
So which would tend to show up as a larger liability if you think of a big project that was funded traditionally and by PPP, which would show up as a larger liability?
I think I'll avoid answering the question, what's more expensive, PPP or traditional borrowing or better value?
Is that the same question?
Yeah.
It's not really.
I think essentially it would depend on the mechanics of the individual contract for the individual asset and what deal has been able to be negotiated. I think it's worth saying that traditional borrowing comes with costs of servicing the debt, and PPP comes with costs. Often in a PPP scheme, you're paying for more than perhaps you would be.
Well, I mean, I understand that, but I just wondered in terms of the liabilities. And the last question, in terms of that cap, I mean, have we got any comparable figures for local government, just in terms of examining local government borrowings and so on? And does that vary widely from local authority to local authority?
It does. We have an exhibit in the report, Exhibit 10, which shows you by sector for local government, the health service, public corporations and central government, the known commitments for PPP charges. The local government ones are the most significant against those three sectors. And within that, there's a good deal of variation between the 32 councils for their own liabilities there. That's transparent in their own accounts, and the Accounts Commission pulls it together to an extent in its overview report. But again, we think it would be helpful to get that overall picture for the Scottish public sector as a whole for all the reasons we've been
So does that
discussing.
combine their PPP charges and their loan charges all together, kind of thing?
Our exhibit is for PPP charges.
But surely we
here.
need to know them both, because presumably for most local authorities, the loan charges are bigger.
Absolutely. And as Gemma was explaining earlier, for all of this, it is possible to pull it together to get that picture, but it has to be done as a one-off exercise.
So we don't know, do we not really know? I mean, is it quite likely that quite a lot of councils are above the 5%? Is that quite likely?
The 5% cap doesn't apply to
I know
councils.
it doesn't apply, but in practice, though.
I wouldn't want to mislead the committee by taking a stab at that. The Accounts Commission has responsibility for auditing local government, and they have reported a significant amount on this. We can come back to you with more information if that would be helpful.
Thanks.
Thank you, Malcolm, and that concludes the questions from the committee, but I've got a couple more I would like to ask myself. Back to the issue of PPP in paragraph 31, you talk about 93 assets which you say have a combined estimated capital value of 6.1 billion, and then in paragraph 32 you go on to say that the charges for these assets in total, both paid and to be paid, will amount to £32.6 billion for those 6.1 billion in assets, which is a ratio of 5.3 times, the total payments a ratio of 5.3 times the capital value. And then you go on over the page to look at, talking about public-private partnerships, private finance initiative and the non-profit distributing model, but you don't have any kind of similar ratios. So what's the ratio in terms of payments to capital value for the non-profit distribution model?
Used PPP as an umbrella term, which includes both PFI and NPD. So the figure here combines the information for projects of both sorts. I don't know if Gemma can provide a bit more information about it. I suspect not. Our intention here hasn't been to audit PFI and NPD, but instead to give that overall picture of the long-term commitments which reflect the investment in assets that's been made over a period of time.
Government is actually choosing between one measure or another. Surely it's helpful to have, the difference in costs laid out.
And that's a piece of work we may carry out in future, but it's not the focus of this piece of work. What we haven't done is to audit individual PPP projects, whatever their sort, to investigate what the relative costs and benefits are. And as Mark says, that is quite a complex exercise because of the range of things included in different contracts across the different sectors of the public sector. That's not what we've done here, although it would be possible to do it in future.
Transparency in public policy making to do so, though?
It may do. I guess the question is whether it's a role for audit or one for government to take forward.
Okay, thank you on that. Now, just another point which was following on from the session that we actually had earlier on today, the 90-minute session looking at the National Performance Framework and how it links in with the Scottish budget. I'm just wondering if you feel that there is any evidence, or not as the case may be, of the impact of the National Performance Framework on spending decisions by the Scottish Government.
At the moment, it's hard to see where that evidence would sit. We had a very useful session with the Public Audit Committee a couple of meetings ago where they were focusing on data quality, the data available to government in demonstrating the effectiveness of its policies. As a result of that, they've agreed that we'll do some work with the government looking at the data that's required to underpin the National Performance Framework so that you can link the outcomes to inputs and outputs. And obviously a key part of the inputs there is the spending decisions, the amount of money spent. And we're very conscious that integrated reporting is a big development right across the accounting and auditing world globally and in both the public and private sector. And further out, I think there is scope for much better reporting of performance and financial results in a way that does allow you to do that joining up. We're not there yet, but I think there's a real will to make progress on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, that obviously concludes our questions, but I'm just wondering if there's any points you want to make to the committee that perhaps we've missed out in terms of the questions that we've been asking, if there's anything you feel you would wish to touch on.
Thank you, Convener. I think from our perspective that's been a really helpful discussion, and it's been very good for us to have the chance to sit down with the committee. My strong view is that this is an area that will need to continue to evolve with the implementation of the Scotland Act, with the discussion about further financial autonomy or independence in future, and we'd very much welcome the chance to stay engaged with you about what this committee would find useful and further information that we may be able to help with. So thank you for the chance to be with you this morning.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your opening statement, your answer to questions, and thank you to colleagues for asking them. That concludes the public section of our deliberations today, so we'll have a couple of minutes break. Welcome. A couple of minutes break where we'll allow witnesses to leave and go into private session. Thank you.